request for fiscal year 24 is almost $52 billion, a $6.2 billion or 13.6% increase from enacted levels in 23. This includes a $366 million increase for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, $46 million increase for cybersecurity, $238 million cut to nuclear energy. This request is in addition to the billions of dollars already appropriated DOE through the Democrats' tax and spend bill, the infrastructure bill, and the CHIPS Act, all of which passed in the last Congress. I look forward to taking a closer look at the request and DOE's priorities today. Energy is foundational and impacts every aspect of American life. Democrats' rush to green policies are making energy unaffordable for too many Americans. Over the past 2 years, energy prices have skyrocketed. This administration has discouraged private sector investment in critical energy infrastructure like oil and gas pipelines, issued onerous regulations on energy production and processing facilities, maintained a needlessly complex bureaucracy that makes permitting reliable power generation like nuclear energy nearly impossible, and made our energy supply chains more vulnerable to hostile foreign actors. Not long ago, America was an energy superpower. Increased American energy production helped strengthen our economy and gave our industries a competitive advantage, allowed us to challenge adversarial energy dictators without having to worry about global markets, all while decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. President Biden and his Department of Energy have spent the past 2 years ceding that strength and autonomy to hostile nations like China, Russia, and Venezuela. Since the beginning of 2021, retail electricity rates have increased by 8%. Gas prices have increased roughly 46%. Natural gas prices are up roughly 31%. And home heating oil and diesel fuel are up by 49%. Unfortunately, Democrats and President Biden's regressive energy agenda takes a whole-of-government approach to phase out American energy production and ship it overseas to countries like China. In fact, the department recently announced its intention to award $200 million to a Chinese battery company, Microvast. We have yet to hear a good explanation from the department regarding how this company was able to secure taxpayer dollars intended to establish a domestic supply chain for battery technologies. If we follow President Biden's energy agenda, Americans will become even more dependent upon China and Russia. The critical mineral supply chain for renewable energy technologies is largely controlled by those two countries. This rush to green agenda includes an impractical goal of zero carbon electric grid by 2035. And with this impractical goal comes calls for a massive expansion of transmission infrastructure. The driving force behind this push to build transmission is not reliability or to lower costs for consumers. It's largely to connect more renewable energy to the grid. I'm not totally adverse to that. That is why I am wary of a lot of the so-called reforms to the transmission permitting process, as well as a lot of the transmission programs in DOE's budget request. Most are a precursor to achieve this unrealistic rush to green goal. President Biden's energy agenda discourages investment in traditional energy sources that provide 24/7 electricity generation. According to the EIA, last year we added the least amount of interstate natural gas pipeline capacity since the agency began collecting data nearly 30 years ago. This did not happen by accident. Republicans on energy and commerce have solutions to reverse the Democrats' regressive energy agenda. H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Cost Act, passed the House a few weeks ago with a bipartisan vote. Legislation would create a regulatory structure that encourages investment and innovation to bring all forms of energy online. The Department of Energy's core mission is to confront energy security needs that face our nation. This budget request falls short of that goal. Instead, the Biden administration's Energy Department prioritizes Green New Deal policies that raise prices for hardworking Americans and embolden foreign adversaries. When America is a world leader in energy production, the world is safer and a cleaner place. President Biden's Energy Department has put its foot on the scale in favor of green technologies at the expense of reliable fuels like nuclear, natural gas, and hydropower. This is making our supply chains more vulnerable to foreign adversaries, dragging down economic growth, harming our national security, and raising prices for everyday American families. DOE must reverse these policies and return to its core energy security mission. So I want to thank you again, Chair Rogers, for letting me hold this hearing. I want to thank the Secretary for being here, and I look forward to her testimony. And I'll now recognize Ranking Member DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Granholm, thank you so much for joining us today. It's good to see you. I want to commend you and your agency for the critical work that you've been doing in recent years to help us combat the climate crisis and to ensure that Americans continue to have access to the energy that they need as we transition to more renewable forms of electricity. As I've said countless times before while sitting here at this dais, the climate change is an existential threat to the future of this planet, and we must address it immediately, if not past immediately. We know the only way to meaningfully address this crisis is by significantly cutting our greenhouse gas emissions and as quickly as possible. We know that to do that, we have to transition to clean sources of energy now. Breaking our reliance on fossil fuels will not only help us stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis, but it will also protect consumers around the country from the sudden increases in the cost of gasoline that can strain families' budgets. And it will help us ensure that all Americans have access to the affordable, reliable energy that they need. And good news, looking at your budget, I believe the Department of Energy's proposed budget for next year will continue to help put us on a path to do exactly that. By increasing funding for key research projects and initiatives and continuing to focus on industrial decarbonization, supply chain development, and workforce transition, the department is helping us create a cleaner, more diverse energy portfolio right here in the United States. The agency's plans to invest $9.4 billion for energy programs and $8.8 billion for the Office of Science will help the research, development, and demonstration of clean energy technologies and support the important work that's being done by our national laboratories. While there's no doubt we still have a long way to go in making this clean energy transition, the investments that will be made under this proposal will provide critical support to this incredibly important endeavor. It will provide $1.2 billion for industrial decarbonization efforts, including $160 million for the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations to support large-scale industrial decarbonization projects. It includes $75 million to launch the Global Clean Energy Manufacturing Initiative, which will help build resilient supply chains for the clean energy future, a critical component of this fight. And it includes $2 billion to support the clean energy workforce and to help fund key infrastructure projects across the nation, including millions of dollars to help weatherize low-income communities and retrofit their homes to lower energy costs for communities that have been forced to disproportionately bear the brunt of the climate crisis for far too long. Each and every one of these proposals will play a critical role in helping us combat the climate crisis. They will also help us not only stabilize the cost of energy here at home, but lower it for many Americans by making critical new investments to increase our energy efficiency and drive the innovation of new clean energy technologies. This budget also makes common sense investments in cyber and energy system security, as well as environmental health and management for low-income communities. It includes $156.6 million for the Energy Information Agency, whose work provides critical energy information and data that informs our work. It includes $56.6 million for the Office of Technology Transmission to help accelerate the commercialization of new clean energy technologies. And it includes $165.2 million for the DOE Office of the Inspector General to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being used efficiently and effectively. I believe that this budget will allow the DOE to place the United States where it belongs as the leader in the clean energy transition. And I want to thank you, didn't mean to give you a demotion, Secretary Granholm, again for being with us today and for explaining how this is going to happen, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now it's my honor to recognize the gentlelady who is the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for our opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Granholm, welcome. Foundational to our lives and our future is access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy. On energy and commerce, we've worked since the start of this Congress to achieve that promise, most recently by passing H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Cost Act. Today, I'm deeply troubled that the Department of Energy, under your leadership, has put America on a dangerous path that harms our energy security and benefits our adversaries, mainly China. Since day one, Department of Energy has enabled the president to shut down American energy. Rather than sounding the alarm about America's declining energy security, the administration canceled the Keystone Pipeline, begged OPEC, Russia, and Venezuela to produce more oil and gas, supported the completion of Russia's Nord Stream pipeline, and turned to China for solar panels and batteries made with slave labor and dirty manufacturing. As a result, America's energy prices are higher than ever, and we are less energy secure. Gas and electricity prices remain too high. Our electric grid is becoming unstable, and this is driving inflation and hurting Americans and businesses. Because of this, families every day have to make tough choices about whether to put gas in the car or food on the table. Earlier this year, we heard from a local Virginia farmer, David Hickman, a fifth-generation farm owner, whose livelihood has been made worse by these policies. And he told us, and I quote, "This is the most perilous time for American agriculture. In some places like California, the government is even asking people to ration energy. This should be a warning to the Biden administration." One of the first orders of business this Congress was the passage of bipartisan bills to stop President Biden and Department of Energy from mismanaging the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and sending our emergency stockpile to China. Now, our SPR is at the lowest level in 40 years. I'm equally concerned that this administration is making us more dependent upon China. America has the highest labor and environmental standards in the world. We value liberty and equality. Madam Secretary, you support waivers for solar panels sourced from China? Even when China violates our trade laws, uses slave labor, and pollutes more than any other nation. Department of Energy is spending hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars to force an energy transition on Americans with a false promise of 100% wind, solar, and battery-powered energy, the supply chains for which are basically controlled by adversarial China. And at the same time, the administration is threatening to ban natural gas stoves and other home appliances that Americans rely on. We've seen the future that these proposed policies and government mandates lead to. I recently visited Europe with other Energy and Commerce Committee members, and it was clear that Europe's rush to green destroyed their energy and manufacturing industries and increased their reliance on adversaries like Russia and China. And now Europe is in an energy crisis following Russia's war with Ukraine. We cannot let Europe's mistakes become America's future. DOE must return to its core mission, its mission to protect America's energy security and our way of life. Which brings us to the budget request for fiscal year 2024. Last year, DOE received a 200% boost in funding, nearly $100 billion, and up to $350 billion in new loan authorities. And that's an additional to its regular appropriations of $46 billion. This year, the request is to increase the budget to $52 billion. Our constitutional responsibility is to ensure that the Department of Energy carries out its mission. And the mission is for two of our nation's most critical missions. That's maintaining our nuclear weapons and ensuring America's energy security. Rather than being focused on this core mission, we see the department prioritizing the implementation of a rush to green agenda and rushing to spend money without taking the steps to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. The actions taken by Department of Energy and the alarming comments that you've made, Madam Secretary, about commending China and suggesting that the U.S. follow the Chinese Communist Party's lead have failed to reassure me that DOE's priorities are aligned with the needs of Americans or the national and energy security interests of the United States. We must abandon this dangerous and radical agenda so that people, Americans, have the opportunity for a better life and a secure future. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Flown, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And after hearing from our committee's Republican leadership, I have to say that I support strongly President Biden's energy agenda, which I know is your energy agenda, frankly, I don't think we'd be able to compete in the global economy if we don't, and certainly not compete with China, if we don't move forward with the president's energy agenda. And I want to also say that I think that H.R. 1 would destroy our economy and certainly reverse the remarkable and robust job creation that we've seen under President Biden. So in my opinion, you are doing everything that's necessary to compete with China and recognize fully well the competition that we face with China. I wanted to say, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we've certainly given the Department of Energy a lot of work to do, and I'm looking forward to getting updates on some of these important clean energy programs today. Let me start with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which invests $1.2 trillion to modernize our nation's aging and crumbling infrastructure. The law includes important funding for DOE to invest in American manufacturing, increase access to energy efficiency, and make our nation's electric grid more clean and secure. Now, that was the first step, and then we followed it up by passing the Inflation Reduction Act. That law provides $369 billion to build more clean energy in America, create clean energy jobs, lower energy costs for American families, and slash greenhouse gas pollution. And DOE is also playing a major role in implementing these funds. They're supporting innovative clean energy projects that are investing in communities all around the nation and have helped create 142,000 good-paying clean energy jobs since the law was enacted in August. They're also providing rebates to consumers for more efficient home appliances to lower energy costs for hardworking American families. And DOE is addressing emissions at America's industrial facilities as well. Now, these two laws, the Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, are making a real difference in communities all around the nation, including in Republican congressional districts. But as we know, not one Republican on this committee supported either of these bills. And that was bad enough, but now they're trying to hold our economy hostage by threatening a default crisis if we don't go along with their demands to roll back these crucial investments and to put polluters over people. Last month, House Republicans passed the Default on America Act that does the bidding of big oil and gas, increases energy costs for working families, and sets American workers up to be left behind by abandoning our homegrown clean energy industry. The Republican bill will cut important programs that provide rebates to consumers for home appliances and remove funding for workforce programs in these new and developing industries. It also repeals key energy programs from the Inflation Reduction Act, repeals the zero-emission nuclear power tax credit that was praised by our witness at a recent hearing on nuclear issues, and raises taxes on American energy. Committee Republicans have not only been trying to undermine these new laws, but they've attempted to manufacture scandals that simply do not exist. Last month, they even sent a letter to you, Madam Secretary, criticizing you for your, quote, international travel to Puerto Rico. Of course, Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens for over 100 years, and with all the energy issues there, we should be commending the Secretary for visiting Puerto Rico and prioritizing their issues. At the end of the day, Republican energy policies look to the past, while Democrats and the Biden administration are looking to the future with our commitment to the clean energy transition. The President's DOE budget request includes important funding that will help us meet our decarbonization goals and build on the success of both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So I also want to highlight the good work that the Department is doing outside of these laws. Last year, DOE periodically released crude oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help lower gasoline prices at the pump for Americans following Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Today, the price of a barrel of crude is $34 cheaper than it was a year ago. The price of a gallon of gasoline is nearly 80 cents cheaper than it was a year ago. So, Secretary, thank you for the Department's decisive action in this regard, and thank you again for joining us today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. So our witness today is the Honorable Jennifer Granholm, Secretary of the Department of Energy, who I understand drove her electric vehicle up to the Hill to testify today this year. So you're recognized for 5 minutes, Madam Secretary.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette and members of the subcommittee. So honored to be with you today to discuss the President's latest budget request for the Department of Energy. Over the last 2 years, it has been my great privilege to lead the department in meeting many of our nation's most pressing needs, from deepening our energy security by reshoring supply chains and manufacturing, to strengthening American innovation with cutting-edge research and development, to maintaining a strong nuclear deterrent. We are positioning the United States to outmaneuver aggressors, outcompete our rivals, and create new jobs and opportunities for the American people. The President's budget request for fiscal year 24 will empower us to drive these endeavors forward, even in the face of emerging challenges. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sparked a reckoning with our over-reliance on fossil fuels. Vladimir Putin has exploited this over-reliance, injecting extreme volatility into global markets and leaving working people in the United States bearing higher energy costs. In response, we're pursuing a strategy of energy security through energy diversity. Congress has made the United States the world's most attractive destination for investment in new energy. And the department is helping the country capitalize using the resources that you have provided. Through the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and regular appropriations, we're backing large-scale deployment of solar, wind, electric vehicles, and storage. We're funding demonstrations of next-generation technologies, clean hydrogen, advanced nuclear, carbon capture. We're building a more resilient, reliable grid that can integrate this increasing number of solutions while better weathering disruptions. And we're shoring up supply chains so that no adversaries will be able to threaten our access to energy. This is all to the great benefit of American companies, American communities, and American workers. In the last 2 years, for example, planned investments in America's battery, solar, and wind supply chains have reached more than $100 billion. Those investments will support thousands of jobs, especially manufacturing technologies that are stamped Made in the USA. Still, we know that the more we can improve performance and reduce costs, the faster we can deploy these technologies, the faster the bills for Americans will be lower. And that's why the budget boosts our clean energy research, development, and demonstration programs. A couple of highlights: our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management is advancing a suite of CCUS technologies, as well as technologies to recover critical minerals from carbon sources. Our Office of Science would receive more than $1 billion for fusion research, furthering our work to harness fusion's tremendous potential. And our Office of Nuclear Energy is driving innovation in nuclear fission and keeping our domestic fleet online so we can make the most of this clean, reliable baseload power. Programs like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program and the Civil Nuclear Credit Program are helping us to cut carbon pollution and boost grid reliability. And through our consent-based siting process, we're getting closer to identifying sites for interim storage of spent nuclear fuel. Furthermore, the budget provides more than $8 billion for our Office of Environmental Management to treat radioactive tank waste, to address contamination issues across EM sites, and to enhance river protection. Particularly at the Hanford site, I would note that the request aligns with an announcement that we made last week, which is we've reached a conceptual agreement with the EPA and Washington State's Department of Ecology for managing millions of gallons of tank waste at the Hanford site in a safe, effective, and achievable manner. And that achievement would not have been possible without bipartisan support from Congress. Your support is indispensable to all of our core missions, and we will need it for the work ahead. The President's budget will allow us to shore up our energy security and our national security while reinforcing our efforts to properly implement Congress's legislative actions. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back, and so now I'll begin the questioning portion of the hearing. Before we do, I'd like to enter into the record an article here about the need for domestically sourced enriched uranium and get away from Russia. So without objection, so ordered. So electricity prices in the nation are 52% higher over the last 2 years than they were for the last 4 years, or the only 4 years under the last administration. And for the record, I'll reiterate that you've increased the budget for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy by $366 million, while also cutting $238 million to nuclear energy. We'll get back to nuclear in a minute. but I wonder why cut nuclear power investments by that amount. The PJM interconnection, the nation's largest grid operator, issued a dire warning earlier this year regarding the premature retirement of dispatchable generation. This report noted that at the current pace of retirements, the grid operator will potentially face a significant generation capacity shortfall by 2030. PJM noted numerous policies directly impacting these premature generation retirements, including multiple EPA regulations, and we just saw another one today, state rush to green policies, and private sector ESG commitments. Massive tax credits and subsidies are unreliable. Wind and solar are contributing to this problem as well. These are all issues that policymakers, the Biden administration, and congressional Democrats specifically are forcing onto the American people, decreasing grid reliability and raising consumer costs. It seems the Biden administration's energy policy is a pay more, get less. So I know the DOE signed a memorandum of understanding with the EPA regarding coordination on electric reliability, but the agreement seems to do nothing in practice. What specific actions is your department taking to improve grid reliability?
Several things, thank you. One is we are making sure that we have enough transmission to ensure that the grid is able to take on the additional resources that we want to see continue to be deployed, including clean energy. That includes nuclear, that includes hydroelectric, that includes geothermal, that includes solar, that includes wind, and that includes battery storage.
How about some specifics? Those are all general topics, and we could agree with that, but how about some specifics that you're doing?
Well, specifically, we are accelerating the implementation and deployment of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which helps to increase grid reliability. So, for example, we have just announced a series of funding opportunities called the GRIP program, which will enhance the reliability of the grid by giving grid operators the opportunity to reconductor, to make sure that they also enhance security by potentially undergrounding, by adding additional transmission. So the tools that have been given to the department related to grid reliability are very important to be able to ensure that we have enough access to reliable power and that the transmission grid is able to withstand it.
So we're going to need transmission line permitting reform. We also need gas pipeline permitting reform. In my statement, I referenced the concerning lack of natural gas pipeline capacity and its effects on energy reliability, especially dispatchable energy. This committee adopted reforms to the interstate natural gas pipeline permitting process, which ultimately passed the House bipartisanly. The reliability of our electricity system is closely interconnected with the interstate natural gas pipeline system. We need to build more to improve electric reliability. Do you believe insufficient natural gas pipeline capacity harms grid reliability and affordability for consumers?
I think we have to have sufficient infrastructure to make sure that we have the dispatchable power
Infrastructure means
that we need.
expansion of pipelines, more pipelines, and
We are going to need pipelines certainly for making sure that dispatchable power gets to the places where it is, it's needed.
where it needs
But
to
we
get
also
to be
need-
utilized by the utilities, correct?
We also need to be able to have pipelines for hydrogen, for
Carbon capture,
carbon capture, et cetera.
export,
So-
you could throw that in there to help the world.
And I would say that your observation about permitting reform is right on. We need to do permitting reform across the board, and I'm hopeful that this
I look forward to
Congress will be
working with
able
you
to
on
get there.
that. So I want to talk on nuclear real quick. I recently chaired a subcommittee on nuclear energy, and it was bipartisan. I was pleased by that. There was widespread agreement, and there is widespread agreement, both chambers and both sides of the aisle. It's been over 2 years, and the DOE still hasn't complied with the congressional directions to stand up an advanced nuclear fuel, or HALEU, program. Is that reflective of DOE or administrative policies, and why we have this delay?
Well, we need to do a whole project with respect to HALEU and uranium overall to make sure that we can fuel our current fleet as well as the advanced reactors. We do not want to be reliant on Russia. We have started to set up a uranium reserve. We have asked for, and we will be issuing a funding opportunity announcement for
My time's expiring. Let me just ask you this. Why cut nuclear energy funding by $238 million?
Because that funding had been used to fund the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and that is now funded over at through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and so it would have been duplicative. So it's something that the Office of Nuclear Energy actually supported. because we didn't need that funding at this moment.
Thank you for that. My time's expired. I'll now go to the ranking member, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Madam Secretary, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the climate crisis is an existential threat that has to be addressed as quickly as possible. And you know quite well, because you're on the front line, we have to slash our greenhouse gas emissions and transition to clean energy and provide energy at an affordable rate to Americans. So I have a couple questions. I assume you agree with me that to combat the worst impacts of climate change, we have to drastically reduce our emissions. Is that right?
I do.
And one way to do that is to rapidly deploy zero carbon emitting sources of wind and solar and other sources. Is that right?
Correct.
But now, I mean, let's cut to the chase. The last 10% of emission reductions will be the hardest, and we don't yet have the technology to be able to say we can get to 100% by 2050. So how is the agency positioning itself and its work to actually be able to close that gap and to meet the goals we need to make?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, both on the research and development side through our work at the labs and our work in the department, as well as on the deployment side, we will be doing both on the difficult to decarbonize areas, such as industrial decarbonization, heavy transportation, aviation, et cetera. Part of the, and thank you for supporting the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, those tools will allow for us, and we've got a funding opportunity announcement out for industrial decarbonization, but it's also the budget actually supports an increased amount for our Office of Decarbonizing Industry. But we also are seeing that with hydrogen and the hydrogen hubs, that is a tool that can be used to decarbonize heavy industry, cement, et cetera, steel. That tool is important. And decarbonizing heavy transportation. Our Vehicle Technologies Office and the work that we've done on both electrification as well as fuel cells for transportation, also very, very important. And then I would say carbon capture and sequestration is another tool to be able to help to decarbonize heavy industry, all of which we are working on both on the research side as well as on the deployment side.
That's great. One of the things that we talk a lot about in this committee, and it's a very real concern, is what are we going to do about the fossil fuel workforce? I represent Colorado, which is traditionally an oil and gas state, but I think that as we try to move towards a clean energy economy, we have to transition the workforce. So can you talk to me about what's happening, both the investments in the last Congress and also in this budget, to help continuity for the existing energy workforce? Yeah,
there are several things that are happening. One is that there is an all-of-government approach to being able to focus on the skill sets that will be needed for next-generation technologies and making sure we're able to upskill the workers, particularly in fossil communities, but also in communities that have high unemployment. What we want to do is create sector-specific skill sets and make sure that those are taken in a place-based manner. When grants are awarded, for example, to hydrogen hubs, we need workers to be able to both build as well as to operate facilities. The fossil fuel workforce, for example, those who do natural gas, who extract natural gas, who extract oil from beneath the subsurface, have an expertise in subsurface fuels. They can also be transitioned to geothermal, for example. Those who build offshore wind platforms can also be building offshore, who build offshore oil and gas platforms can build offshore wind platforms. Those skills matches are part of what the department is working on through our workforce development initiatives, as well as through the skills, tools that the Congress has given us on, through the Inflation Reduction Act, on apprenticeships, et cetera, funding and incentivizing those apprenticeships.
Thank you. I have one last question because we've had a lot of hearings and markups in this committee already this year, for which I commend the chairman because we have to work on energy. But one thing that folks on the other side of the aisle keep pounding on, we can't do this just through, they keep somehow insinuating the administration's trying to move to a zero carbon emissions program just through solar and wind. And I want to be clear, has the administration said we're not going to have nuclear or hydro power or other types of things, of energy sources?
On the contrary, the administration is very much in favor of nuclear, hydroelectric power, geothermal power. We want to grow the energy pie by adding diverse forms of sources, of clean energy sources, and to decarbonize the existing fossil fuel sources. We want to do both.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Madam Secretary, I appreciate you being here. The war in Russia really exposed our energy security vulnerabilities and the danger of relying on adversaries for our energy needs. And I've had numerous conversations with our European allies, and they regret some of the decisions that were made that led them to this place to be dependent, dangerously dependent on Russia natural gas. And they've been pleading with us for years for America to increase our LNG exports. Now, in America, we are blessed with some of the world's largest and cleanest supplies of fossil fuels, the critical minerals for renewables, plentiful supplies for uranium to power our nuclear reactors. But unfortunately, we're falling behind on the processing of those minerals and uranium. China controls more than 90% of the critical minerals processing used for renewables and batteries. And the U.S. nuclear fleet imports more than 20% of its enriched uranium from Russia. Reliance on Russian-sourced nuclear fuel has weakened our nuclear fuel infrastructure and now puts our whole nuclear security at risk. Congress imposed a ban on Russian oil and gas imports. Do you support a ban on importing Russian-enriched uranium into the U.S. as well?
I would certainly consider that if we have developed our own supply. We want to be energy independent. We don't want to harm the existing fleet, but we want to build up that energy supply, and hopefully Congress
Thank you. I'm going to
will
take
work on
back my time, and we need I have a whole bunch of yes or no questions here. Will you commit to working with me on legislation to ban the import of Russian-sourced nuclear fuels?
Again, I would support making sure that our fleet is secure and that we have enough supply, and that means making it here. And I hope we can work together on a uranium strategy that ensures that we can have that for our own fleet.
Yes, and we got to ban natural gas, or we got to ban the nuclear coming from Russia, and then we got to work on getting supply here too. Yes, yes or no? Do you agree that because China controls more than 90% of the critical materials used to make solar panels and batteries, that America is becoming dependent on one supplier, China, for our energy needs?
I think America is becoming more dependent on ourselves because of the investments that were made through the Inflation Reduction Act. The Loan Program Office has just financed several processing.
Nothing's being manufactured yet.
Well,
yes or no?
but it is going to be. It is going to be. That's what's so exciting, all the announcements that have been made about batteries, battery supply chain coming to the
Reclaiming my
United
time.
States.
Are you aware that China uses slave labor and is the largest polluter in the world? How many critical mineral processing facilities do we have in the United States?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that we must build more processing in the United States, and that's
Let's start.
exactly
Madam Secretary,
what the Inflation Reduction
reclaiming
Act
my
and the
time.
bipartisan
Let's start with how many do we
infrastructure laws
have right now? How many do we have right now?
We just, in fact, the Loan Program Office just financed 3 additional
How many
ones.
existing processing
We
facilities?
don't. We have not done that. It has been in Asia. This is exactly why we cannot stand by and allow that to continue. We want to bring. We don't disagree. I don't think.
Okay.
We want to bring. We want to bring processing here and
Thank
do it
you.
here.
Thank you. How long does it take to permit a
Far too
critical
long.
minerals processing facility in the United States?
Far too long. Far too long.
How many years?
It takes years. It is
many
ridiculous
years?
and unacceptable.
So how many years?
It
Does it
shouldn't
take?
take as long as it does.
How many years?
Let's work on slowing no, excuse me. Let's
You
work
don't
on
want to say
speeding
how
up.
many years it takes.
Well,
because
I don't
we're talking
take
about
responsibility for how many
years.
years it takes. It takes too long. It's years, and it shouldn't be. We should be doing it much more quickly.
So it's going to be years, and in the meantime,
unless we do
there's
permitting
no
reform.
processing in the United States of America, which means it all is going to go to China and come back.
That's
Yes.
exactly what we're not going to happen. That's why we have to do permitting reform,
If you
and that's why
don't
we have
have
to continue to
processing in
invest.
the United States of America, it is.
We are
it is-
investing in it right now. That's why all of
Thank
these
you.
new
Thank
battery
you.
companies
Reclaiming
and
my
processors
time.
have announced they're
Okay,
coming.
reclaiming my time here. Would you support a prohibition on using taxpayer dollars to purchase renewable energy technologies that are manufactured with slave labor?
No.
You won't support a prohibition?
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said, would I support? I do not support slave labor making
Okay, would
solar
you
panels
support a
or us
prohibition
supporting it
on
in any
using
way.
taxpayer dollars to do this, to purchase? Would you support a prohibition on using taxpayer dollars to purchase renewable energy technologies manufactured with slave labor?
Yes.
Would you support a ban on importing renewable energy technologies made with components mined or processed in factories that violate America's environmental standards?
I'd have to look specifically at what you were saying on that, but I want for us to be manufacturing in the United
I do
States.
too.
All the components, the full supply chain for
I do too.
solar,
I
as
do
well
too.
as for
Thank you.
batteries.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I think my point is the difference between what the dream is and what reality is. And the reality is it's not happening here. It's happening. We are dependent upon China. And so we can't get the cart before the horse. I yield back.
Julie yields back. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Secretary, again, thank you for being here. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, and you did as well, over the last 2 years, Congress has passed 2 landmark bills, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, that give the department tremendous resources to lower energy prices for everyday Americans while making our energy cleaner for everyone. So the budget request from your department built on these laws by making additional investments in affordable clean energy made right here in America, which you can continue to stress. But the problem is that now the House Republicans' Default on America Act will seriously undermine the progress that we're beginning to make and that you've pointed out. So I wanted to ask you, back in March, you wrote to Appropriations Committee Ranking Member DeLauro and said that capping DOE's fiscal year 2024 spending at 2022 levels would have catastrophic impacts on everyday Americans. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert your letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Objection, so ordered.
Thank you. So I'd ask you, Madam Secretary, could you detail how the DOE budget cuts in the Default on America Act would have a devastating impact on everyday Americans? Do you know how many jobs, for example, might be jeopardized?
Well, first of all, I would say that people care about our investments in research and development. And so the slashing of, for example, 5,000 scientists and research at our 17 national labs would very much hinder our ability to be competitive globally. That's very important. It's my understanding as well that there are rollbacks of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. And to the point we were just making, since the president has taken office and this agenda to invest in America, there have been 150 battery companies or 160 as of last week, 160 battery companies or supply chain companies that have announced they are coming to the United States, all the way from processing, all the way to anode, cathode, separator material, electrolyte, critical, 160. That policy works, and the idea of rolling that back would harm Americans all across the country and communities that will be benefiting from the jobs that would have been created by the policies that were supported by members of this panel and others.
Well, thank you. But you also wrote that the cuts would imperil and reduce the impact of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So can you detail how the budget cuts would impact the bipartisan investments that Congress made just a year and a half ago?
Right. I mean, so those investments in next generation technologies that are in the process of being granted now give the United States a leg up on our competitors. They also make sure that we're able to deploy these technologies at home to make us more energy secure. Why would we cut the ability to undo decades of job losses to competitor nations when we now have policy that brings those jobs home and makes us more energy secure and makes products that are stamped made in America and are used here and are perhaps sold elsewhere, but we are making them here? That makes us energy secure. And cutting both the bipartisan infrastructure law investments in those technologies, as well as the deployment strategies in the Inflation Reduction Act, would harm our nation from an economic point of view as well as from an energy point of view.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I started out by pointing out in my opening statement that contrary to what some of my Republican colleagues are saying, is if you're very much aware of the competition from China, you realize the threat, and that, you know, if you implement what the Republicans want to do with this Default Act, it's going to take us backwards, make us less competitive in a global economy, less able to compete with China. And, you know, the job numbers keep coming out. I mean, just in the last few days, the unemployment's at an all-time low, even lower than it was a few months ago. And the jobs just, you know, keep coming in a very robust fashion. And I'm just convinced that this Default Act would do just the opposite, completely reverse that in the way that you've outlined. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'll go to Texas. Mr. Burgess for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thanks for being here, Madam Secretary. Let me just ask you, can you just kind of briefly bring us up to date on where the department is with the work on reprocessing spent nuclear fuel?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. We have a research program on that we are working at the Idaho National Lab on that. It is smallish, it's not huge. I think it can be much larger. I think we should be looking at this to a much greater extent. So we have some initial research that's being done on that, but I think it's something that is worthy of expansion.
Well, if I can ask, what's holding us back? Why is it smallish? Why isn't it robust?
Historically, it's a good question. Historically, it just hasn't been a huge priority, but I think with the help of Congress and some investment, we can make it a much more robust program.
Well, you addressed the fact that we don't want to be buying our fuel stock for nuclear reactors from Russia. So it seems like the reutilization of spent nuclear fuel would make a lot of economic and geopolitical sense. I guess my concern is with as big as the budget that you have and all of the money that has been pumped in with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and now the President's budget request, it just seems like a larger portion should be dedicated to that research because, I mean, if we want abundant low-carbon fuel, that's the place we're going to get it, correct?
It's one of the places, certainly, and I would support authorization to expand our investment in that area.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say I hope we can have a meaningful hearing on reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel. I think it made no sense when we were debating the President's big bill to be talking about investing all of this money in solar and wind, geothermal even, and not talking about major investments in nuclear power. You used the term a few minutes ago, undergrounding. I think it was in relation to electric transmission lines. So is that, I mean, no one likes to have a big transmission line behind their house. So is the agency studying the underground placement of large transmission lines?
Yeah, as part of the resiliency funding that our Grid Deployment Office is administering, the resiliency component with undergrounding, particularly in areas where there's high wildfires, a great risk of wildfires, et cetera, is potentially one solution. Of course, it is more expensive, but it's also very expensive to build back. There's another component of efficiency that could also, I think, be very beneficial in terms of transmission and acceptance, which is reconductoring existing lines to make them twice as efficient on existing infrastructure so that you have less of the NIMBY problem that is concerned with transmission.
I wasn't aware that reconductoring was a verb, but I appreciate
Like
you
undergrounding, I guess.
you bring that to our attention. Well, it just seems like there, again, with all of the substantial investments that are being made into your agency, these are the types of things that I for one, would be grateful to see some additional work. And we can talk all we want about the other sources of energy, but these are capturing energy efficiency, higher utilization of nuclear power. I mean, these are things that make a lot of sense in the nation's armamentarium. At least it would seem to me that it would. I am concerned. We had a hearing in our Oversight Investigation Subcommittee a few weeks ago, and your Inspector General, Department of Energy Inspector General was here. Really concerned about it's not just the amount of money that's going into the agency, but the rapidity with which the money is leaving the agency. So the velocity of spending, not just the amount of spending. Some of us were here when Solyndra became a four-letter word. I'm really fearful of seeing projects where the money is in fact misdirected. Can you give us some insight in how you're controlling that?
Yeah, first of all, we are grateful to have a great relationship with our Inspector General, and on all of these programs, we consult with that office in how to make sure that there's no waste, fraud, and abuse, that it is designed in a way that is conducive to making sure that the taxpayer is protected. As you have seen in this budget, her budget has been increased by almost double, which is important given the size of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law funds that must go out. Happy to continue to work with this committee in any way you deem important to have regular briefings on the cadence.
She said that wasn't enough, and I know my time's expired, I'm going to yield back, but and that's the concern. The rapidity of the spending is going so fast, the money's going out the door so fast, the Inspector General, Department of Energy can't keep up with it. She says, I need more money to keep up with the money you've already invested. I realize that's a longer-term project or a longer-term question, but we've got to stay focused on that.
Gentlemen,
Thank you,
time's
Mr. Chairman. I'll
expired,
yield back.
and I'll now recognize the acting ranking member, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see you again, Madam Secretary. Thanks for your good work. Last year, Congress provided record funding to build a cleaner and more secure energy system through historic legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I want to thank you for your responses to the chair of the committee, because I think there's a lot of room for agreement. Some of the talking points that I've heard from the other side are inconsistent with what you said today in terms of your support for nuclear power, for hydro, and for carbon capture and all sorts of clean energy strategies and batteries. So I think we should be encouraged by that. And the other thing you talked about is that you acknowledge that things take too long. And I think in this Congress, we need to work on speed. If we don't, we can have all the money in the world, but we will not succeed if we don't build things faster. Particularly because a lot of what we want to do on climate action is build stuff, not slow stuff down. So I want to thank you and the White House for recognizing the need for that permitting reform, for using your existing authority to speed deployment. And I want to continue to work with you and your team to advance a bipartisan reform this year that will be durable over time because it's bipartisan. So first, I just want to make sure that you seem to agree that permitting and siting reform for clean energy is essential to meet our climate goals. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Do you think we could solve our permitting challenges simply with funding for agencies, or do we need to both provide funding and additional underlying process and authority reforms?
I think there needs to be process as well as funding.
Maybe you could just give us a little flavor for how permitting challenges impair your ability to deploy clean energy projects and provide specific examples that might be on top of your mind.
In terms of what I would do to increase efficiency on permitting?
Sure, or what, what the holdups now and how you would
Yeah,
address
I mean, clearly the holdups are the fact that you have processes that require reviews that are consecutive and not concurrent. And so now it takes twice as long when things can be done concurrently. We want to make sure that we have some, for example, a better use, maybe a more liberal use of categorical, exclusions in particular types of devices that have the same footprint. We shouldn't have to be doing a whole new study around it, assuming that the area is, that there's not some sort of other violation. We should be doing a greater job of, for example, programmatic energy assessments to be able to take a swath of area and say, this is okay to be able to build on. We should be developing more projects, more bigger goals about how quickly we want to get there, perhaps some kind of time limit. We don't want to degrade the environmental laws. But we want to be able to administer them in a way where there is alacrity, where we are moving quickly on them. And we can do that because, of course, slowness impacts species because we will not be able to address climate change.
And disadvantaged communities, by the way, sure. Right?
Of course.
Who are most affected by the pollution.
Of course.
I'll also say, we saw something from one study that showed it takes on average 10 years to do one interstate transmission line.
Ridiculous.
7 years of that is processed. So you and I see eye to eye on this. And I think transmission is going to be one of our big objectives. I helped pass the Power On Act last year to give backstop siting authority to FERC. I think that's a good start. This week, DOE issued a request for information on a new process for designated national interest electric transmission corridors. That's going to be helpful. And would focus on narrow routes proposed by applicants as opposed to larger corridors designated from scratch by DOE. How do you think that approach can help advance and speed up transmission?
Well, first of all, glad to say that the approach is based upon a needs study that has been completed about where the most need is in the country. Number two is that this step that was taken this week is gleaning information from industry partners about how they think NHTSA corridors should best be done. But what we want to do is to give them the ability to apply for NHTSA corridor designation. That will happen in September-ish area. Well, we close down the funding opportunity, the notice of intent and the request for information. So this year, we'll have set the stage for rapid movement and designation of those corridors, and then it unlocks resources to be able to do that, whether it is the transmission financing resources, it could be the funding that comes from the bipartisan infrastructure law that helps to fund those transmission lines. So all of that, it's unlocked, and that will happen this year.
And I'm going to run out of time, but I do want to ask you the same question I've asked Mr. Landrieu, Mr. Podesta this morning, Secretary Raimondo. If there are ways that we need to help you speed things up through legislative changes, please let us know so we can get to work on them as soon as possible. Can you do that?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, time's expired. I'll now go to Mr. Latta from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary. Good to have you back. You said a little earlier that we can't ban Russian uranium until we have our own domestic industry built up. But industry has said they need to have the certainty if they're going to invest in that. Wouldn't Congress passing the ban with possible waivers send that market a signal and help provide the industry with that certainty that we have to have out there?
It's possible, but I'm worried. My worry is about the gap, right? We need to build up this supply here, and I think the way to do that is to work with Congress on a uranium strategy that gives us the ability to finance the processing, the conversion, the enrichment in the United States. So this was, we got a down payment on that through the $700 million, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. We need about $2.1 billion and a revolving fund to be able to send the message both to industry and to not cut the legs out from under the existing
Because,
fleet.
the fear out there, though, is it's the time factor we have. And, if we just keep putting it off, I think we have to have a time limit out there that we make sure that the United States is going to take care of itself. But let me just go on another point that was brought up a little bit earlier, because this is something I've been very interested and involved in with our spent nuclear rods. You mentioned about that the United States is behind. France has been doing this for years. Not only is France doing it, but France is also reprocessing rods for other countries. So why are we lagging?
Yeah, I think this is the question. I mean, in France, it's heavily subsidized by the French government, and that could be one way of going. I think what we have been looking at in our research is how to commercialize it in a way where private entities can take this on. However, your point about us thinking differently about how we've done this is very important so that we can be independent, and I would eager to have that
Well,
conversation.
and it's really important because, again, just to finish up on this point, because, if we go out there and you think about all the rods we have out there right now around the entire country, we wouldn't need to worry about uranium for a little while because we've got it right now. Let me move on to another area. I'm very concerned that the Biden administration and states like California are pursuing policies that will undermine the reliability of the grid. And you also mentioned a little earlier that we have to have enough transmission out there. And you know, there's proponents out there saying that we need to have EVs by 2035, but we also saw what happened in California around Labor Day of last year, where we saw the governor saying that people needed to turn their air conditioners up and not plug their cars in. And then the other problem has been is that when you're talking about transmission and where we're going to get it, that, for example, EIA in 2019, these are their 2019 estimates, that the United States would need to generate at least 50% more electricity to power all the electric vehicle fleet. And that's 4 years ago. And we've been seeing a push for even more. With the administration pushing for these unreasonable standards, I believe that, and we're seeing today we want to be shutting down coal and gas-fired power plants around the country and losing that baseload capacity out there. What's the plan to generate the levels of electricity for this country that we're going to need for all of our vehicles and appliances, especially your home state, Michigan, Ohio, mine? We're heavy manufacturing. We need baseload. It's not intermittent power. Where are we going to get it from?
Yeah, so here, a couple of responses to that. Number one is that the wind and solar are intermittent. We know that. And we have to add the technology associated with battery storage to make them more like baseload. And we are making great breakthroughs in that. And in many places, they've already started to deploy wind-solar combinations that get them a reliable grid. However, it is clear that this is a transition. We cannot flip a switch automatically and expect that everything is going to be 100% clean tomorrow. This is why what the EPA did today was to give a ramp that goes to 2040 so that we have the time to be able to develop and deploy the
Just to reclaim my time, because
technologies.
you know, when you've been out and heard from the industry and all like that, they said we just can't get there by 2035, and even if it's 2040, they're saying we got a problem. Well, let me finish up on one other question, because again, I'm concerned about some of the proposed actions out there for U.S. consumers that prefer top-loading machines. And the proposed standard would also drastically increase the upfront cost of basic new clothes washers by nearly $200, according to the department's own estimates, which would have a particularly negative impact on low-income consumers. Will you commit to that any final DOE clothes washer standard will guarantee that consumers will continue to have access to top-loading washers of various capacities without a significant price surge for consumers?
We're always concerned about the price, both short-term in the upfront costs as well as the long-term price, the savings that are generated, particularly for lower-income people. This is an open proposed
But I just
rule,
want to make,
so we're eager to hear.
if we can get a yes or no on that, that you'll make sure that we're not going to see these increases, that we need DOE to be out there saying that we're not going to have these high increases for these people across the country with these top-loading washing machines. Would DOE commit to that?
I would commit that we are not going to raise significantly the price of top-loading washing machines.
I'm going to take, Madam Secretary, I'm going to take that for a yes. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'll now go to Ms. Fletcher from Texas, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, and thank you, Secretary Granholm, for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us today. As we have heard from several folks today, the legislation that we passed in the last Congress has been historic and transformational, and is really important in investing in technologies that are going to power our future while reducing our emissions and helping us address our climate goals and achieve them. And we have already seen the market respond, in addition to what we're seeing in terms of investments from the government. We're seeing, I think, $242 billion of new clean energy investments have already been announced. We are certainly seeing that in Houston, and we are seeing some of the challenges as well. And so I want to follow up on some of the questions that you were just discussing with Mr. Peters, specifically around permitting reform, and drill down a little bit. I really appreciated your testimony about how to address some of the challenges that we see, and it's certainly something that I hear from my constituents. In one area in particular I wanted to ask you about, we've seen exploding demand for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The Houston Carbon Capture Storage Alliance was recently formed to really take, to advance what is one of, I think, the most the biggest CCUS opportunities in the world. The collection of energy companies, organizations, academia, and institutions and experts are working together so that the region can store 100 million metric tons of carbon per year by 2040. So this is really an incredible opportunity, and the work that DOE has done up to this point has made this possible. But there is still work to do, as you have already testified. And I think one of the challenges we see is that while the technological capabilities exist and the funding to deploy the technology is included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there are still barriers to a functioning ecosystem, and it is primarily relating to permitting, how we build the infrastructure to do this, to transport and store the carbon, and also permitting Class 6 wells is hindered by these long regulatory timelines that you were discussing. And so while these aren't the primary jurisdiction of the Department of Energy, I understand, I do think the department has a role in convening the stakeholders and working together with other agencies to really advance a whole of government approach to ensuring success for CCUS. So I would love it if you could talk for a minute about what steps you've taken to work with EPA and other relevant agencies to really drive a whole of government approach to addressing these challenges, in particular when it comes to CCUS.
Yeah, we are in constant contact with EPA about this because this whole effort to try to sequester is not going to work unless you have a place for it to be sequestered in. And less on EPA, but more for our Loan Programs Office, we have the ability now to finance the pipelines to be able to move the CO2 as well, and hydrogen as well. So we have to do all of it. We've got to make sure we have the acceptance as well, which obviously there is acceptance, in Texas, in Houston area. We have to make sure that we are bringing along the community as we gain that acceptance. We have to make sure we can safely sequester, and we have to make sure we can transport. All of that infrastructure is necessary, and now we have the tools to be able to help industry get there. But the permitting side and the government side of this has got to be addressed, and we have to move with greater speed. And I hope, everybody keeps talking about it, right, left, White House, so I'm hopeful that we can all agree that we need to do this and compromise to get that done.
Well, thank you. I hope so too. And I appreciate your commitment to doing that. And I think you really serve in such an important capacity as a convener here. And I know the interest is sincere on our side of the aisle. And it's certainly something I hear about every day when I talk to my constituents about the challenges and really the opportunities that are in front of us. With that in mind, I want to switch gears a little bit and follow up on a question, touch on something that Mr. Pallone mentioned in his opening remarks. I agree that the department's use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the last year has been very important in bringing down the cost of gasoline. Last year, President Biden announced that the administration was targeting a price range of roughly $67 to $72 per barrel of crude to refill the SPR, and that's a $20 per barrel profit. So I understand that the department is currently completing long-mandated modernization work on some of the caverns, and that the cavern infrastructure right now is not ready to receive physically some oil. But I want to point out that the oil markets are currently backward dated, and that means that the future prices are lower than the current prices, and oil futures for this fall are currently within the department's target price range for purchase. So I would love to ask, and maybe get the answer in the record, how the DOE can take full advantage of the current low oil prices to refill the SPR, and how, or if any additional authorities are needed from Congress to be able to do so.
No, I think we have the authorities to be able to do it. Right now, in addition to the maintenance that is happening, the life extension program, we're also doing congressionally mandated sales. And that congressionally mandated sale of 26 million barrels will be completed by June. And it's at that point where we will flip the switch and then seek to purchase.
John
So
Lay,
we hope
time's
to be able to
expired.
take advantage.
I'm going to go to Mr. Guthrie
you.
from Kentucky.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Brett Guthrie from Kentucky, but I lived a year in Grand Rapids
All right.
learning the automotive supply business. And, the EV is exciting in my area. I represent I-65 between Louisville and Nashville, obviously not south of the Tennessee border, but essentially between Louisville and Nashville. And we have Blue Oval, SK, which is locating there in Elizabethtown, and then Envision coming in. And so it's important, but it's been brought up a couple of times. One of our biggest concerns is baseload power. just to supply the battery plants, not necessarily, I mean, that it's set for what they're constructing, but the issue is for moving forward and expanding baseload power. So just think there's a lot of concerns in moving to electric vehicles. There are just a lot of concerns. And it seems that when we talk to members of the administration or people who are promoting the fast transition, that a lot of the concerns get just dismissed away. Oh, we'll figure that out and we'll move forward. And you used the term that we're not going to flip a switch. I know that the administration has put out you're going to be 2/3 battery electric vehicles by 2032, so it's 10 years. And you know, it takes about 5 to 7 years to launch a new product for automotive. And that 5 to 7 years actually could be faster, I can tell you that. But it's when you have existing supply base and people just retool their factories. We're talking about building new battery plants, securing lithium, we're securing a lot of other things. And I don't think many people in automotive, if they're giving you a real answer, would say that's doable by 2032, because that's 10 million vehicles. So if you we sell 15 million cars in America, that's 10 million vehicles. So if we could do half of that, which is a big goal if we could do half of that, but half of that means 2/3 of the fleet would be 8 million, because you have half of that would be 5 million electrical vehicles. Or if you even say 2/3 of that, we're talking about selling 10 million cars in America. And I know you were governor of Michigan in 2009 when we sold 9 million cars in America. And what did that do to Michigan? What did that do to America? What did it do to the world when the automotive industry shrunk in half? Now, if you stayed at 2/3, if we can't hit that 2/3 goal, you're talking about shrinking the new sales in America to whatever that level of 2/3 is.
So we don't want to put the cart before the horse, as you say. We want to make sure we have a grid that is capable of taking on electrification. We want to make sure that the goals, and these are just goals, right? The auto industry put forth a goal of half of its fleet being electric by 2030. Obviously, that's the industry goal. That's the administration's goal by 2030. We don't know how fast this is going. We know that electric vehicle sales doubled this past year. We know that it's really accelerating. But to your point, we have to make sure that we have a grid that can withstand it and that we have enough electricity on that grid to be able to make it, which is, again, why I'll just be honest, the tools that have been given to be able to incentivize the deployment of additional energy resources are really important. And I'm grateful to Congress for those who supported that, because it will help us to be able to ensure that we have a reliable grid.
Well, thanks for saying goals, because I say that to a lot of people in automotive. I says, well, you know, I know it's 2032. I don't think anybody can get there, but we're going to move. Well, things like this happen and Congress delays, and I say that. And they say to me, you know, this is an EPA rule. It's not an administration goal. And we can't invest to a goal. We have to invest to what the rules are. And if you're going to tell me, which I can't tell them, hopefully my colleagues here could fix this, but we can't say, well, don't invest according to the rules because somewhere down the road we're going to fix this. This is really changing the investment in the automotive industry. So let's say we get to 5 years down the road and you're saying, well, maybe just half or maybe just a third since we can't get there. Well, people have already got out of powertrain. People aren't making transmissions anymore. And so you're really risking the supply chain. You're really risking moving forward. So just to say it's a goal would be one thing, but putting in as a rule that you kind of get an investment from capital suppliers, I mean, it's really concerning unless we really think, and if all the automotive people get in the room and say, with honesty, and say that we think we can get there in 2032, that's one thing, but I don't think you'll hear that if you get a good answer.
Well, I will say that these rules have been modeled, and the technologies that can allow existing baseload to stay online and meet the rules exist. And Congress has given tools to make sure that they are profitable. So the increase, for example, in the amount of money for carbon capture so that you can keep a baseload plant online, that's really quite amazing and will help to ensure that you have a reliable and growing grid.
Well, baseload's one thing, so that's important. But it's also just getting the supply chain together to go to 2/3. You're completely changing the automotive industry. It's not, and that's what you want to do. I understand that, but it's not, you can't just flip a switch. And I'm just really concerned we're going to really disrupt the automotive chain and the supply chain, which affects, as you know, the economy of America.
Yeah, 160 battery companies coming to America. That's pretty exciting.
I agree with you, but I'm not sure we're going to get to 10 million cars in 10 years. That's the question. Thank you.
Gentleman's time expired. Now go to Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here and being part of this great discussion. You know, each year I lead an appropriations letter with Senator Cortez Mastro and Chairman Carper and Congresswoman Clark supporting increased funding for DOE clean transportation programs. Programs like the Vehicle Technologies Office produce cutting-edge innovations that are crucial to keeping the U.S. one step ahead of our competitors. Medium and heavy-duty vehicles are the largest mobile source of smog-forming pollutants, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and other air toxics. Some heavy vehicle classes, like buses, are ripe for electrification, while others, like long-haul trucks, are more challenging. Question is, what is DOE doing to help decarbonize long-haul trucking, and what technology or infrastructure challenges do we need to overcome in order to eliminate pollution from long-haul trucking?
Yeah, thanks for that question, too, because our Vehicle Technologies Office has been working on this, and the long-haul trucking largely has been focused on both, biofuels is one,
Right.
but also hydrogen fuel cells, very important, especially for fleet. And there's a lot of work being done now on large-scale batteries as well. Those are more expensive. We'll see how that goes, but DOE's long-term research in batteries for vehicles tells you we can reduce the cost. 80% the cost has been reduced 80% for batteries over the past decade. So the continuation of that is very important, as well as looking at the materials that can build those stronger, bigger batteries and substitute out for the more expensive materials that are currently in the lithium-ion batteries.
Yeah, and I was going to follow up on that vehicle battery research, because research into battery technology for electric vehicles is a significant focus of the FY24 budget for the Vehicle Technologies Office. Now, foreign battery companies have made significant advancements in battery technology in recent years. Madam Secretary, what new generation battery technologies is DOE working on, and if commercialized, how will these new technologies potentially impact the range and costs of electric vehicles?
Yeah, so obviously there are batteries for electric vehicles and there's batteries for long-duration storage. And the technologies, sometimes they share and learn from one another, and sometimes they're quite different. For long-duration storage, you can use things like iron flow batteries, because they're bigger and you don't have to worry about putting them into a vehicle.
Sure.
Right? But for vehicles, you want to have substitute materials that lessen your reliance on very expensive materials like cobalt. And so, for example, Argonne National Lab is working on a lithium manganese battery that lessens our reliance on cobalt, and that gets you very great performance for larger vehicles. That kind of technology is what we are looking at. We've got our 17 labs, probably 10 of them are working on next generation materials and substitutes for both long-duration energy storage as well as for vehicles.
Okay, that's great, thank you. My district includes, in Sacramento, includes a decommissioned nuclear generating station at Rancho Seco, and I bring this up every year. The power station closed in 1989, but the spent nuclear fuel is still awaiting transport to a consolidated storage facility. Each year, I lead an appropriations letter in support of DOE's interim storage program, and after years of inaction, I'm pleased to see the recent progress with the consent-based siting approach. Madam Secretary, can you describe how the $53 million in FY24 budget will advance the consent-based siting approach?
Yes, thank you for that question. We issued last year a request for information to find out whether there were communities that might be willing to raise their hand. And then we issued a funding opportunity announcement. We got a number of communities that were willing to enter into those discussions. We will be announcing those awards, I want to say this spring. And then after they have the opportunity to do the work that they need to do to prepare, we will then follow up in 2024 with the ability to be able to start the conversation about actually doing interim storage. Now, we can negotiate, we can have these discussions, but we don't have the authority. DOE does not, Congress needs to give us the authority to actually help site the facilities, both whether it's interim, and I will say that there is, there's concern if you do an interim one, does that mean I'm going to be long-term place as well?
Yeah.
And that authority also needs to
Well,
be.
and I'm looking at, as administration pursues a new fleet of advanced reactors, we have to think about the waste storage. I think some people are thinking, not knowing that what kind of waste are we going to have, how are we going to deal with it? And if we can take care of this, it would be really important for our thinking about the nuclear industry to move in a positive way.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
John Lady's time expired. I'll now go to Mr. Griffith for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Secretary Granholm, are you aware that China reportedly permitted or began construction on coal units equivalent to about 2 coal-fired power plants per week in 2022?
They are the world's largest emitter.
And they're building more coal plants. That's correct, is it not?
That's correct.
And I surmise that last year's renewed construction, based on the reports that I've read, is likely in response to grid failures that China experienced last summer due to heat and drought, especially after today's EPA announcement of its newest crackdown on fossil fuel plants. What are we going to do in our country to mitigate coal and natural gas power plant closures and ensure that America doesn't fall prey to grid failures like China did?
A great question, and it's one of the reasons why the funding for carbon capture and sequestration, the amount of money going to $85 per ton for sequestration is an incentive to install decarbonization technologies on coal plants and on natural gas plants as well. That will enable those plants to keep running. If there are a plant that's already announced that they are closing, they don't have to install any of that stuff. But if they are going to be long-term, I think because of the resources that has been given, it allows for them to continue to operate, but without CO2 emissions.
Well, and based on your statement just now, if you're already planning to close, or if you're going to close, you don't have to spend the money. Isn't that actually going to do the opposite and encourage more plants to close and therefore put our grid at risk?
I think that those are private investment decisions by those, by the operators of
Driven
those
by your
plants.
policies?
Well, I don't think so. I think we want to make sure that we have decarbonized our electric system, and that's why the technologies exist.
We're just going to have to
be
disagree
able
on
to
that,
do
Madam Chair, or Madam Secretary. I appreciate it. Kathy Morris-Rogers and I, in my her in capacity as chair of the full committee, in my capacity as chair of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, wrote to you last year requesting a briefing to include specific information regarding the department's October 2022 announcement of a $200 million award to Microvast and the department's review of potential ties to the Chinese Communist Party. That requested briefing has not occurred, and your written response from February of this year did not provide the requested information. Instead, the department stated that it would not provide more information on this award while it was still undergoing a, quote, post-selection risk-based due diligence review. Is it here's the question, is it standard procedure for the department to begin conducting due diligence reviews more than 3 months after it announces an award?
The department conducts reviews after the announcement of a selection, because that always happens, and every person, every entity that is selected gets a letter saying that this is not a done deal. You have to go through a due diligence process. With the additional funds that have been now coming through the Department of Energy and the grant funding, we have set up a process that is informed by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to ensure that we vet everyone that's made it through the technical review. So there's several layers of review to be able to be eligible for funding. In the instance you've described, not a dollar has gone out. So just to be clear, there is a serious process of vetting that's going with everyone that was selected now. And that is a serious looking under the hood to make sure taxpayers are protected and that no IP is going to China.
And has that always been the case when you all do an award?
We've always done vetting, but this time we are, because of the new funding that we have, we've set up a different and more intense process that is involving the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and their process.
And I'm not against that, but I am curious, when did you all develop this? Was it before the grants were announced? Or I forgot the words you just used, but before the grants were selected. There you go. Thank you. before the grants were selected, or was this a process that came about subsequent because of some of the negative press you got about microvast?
Well, let me just say that we've always had a vetting process. And now, in the fall, we set up a more intensive vetting process because of the additional funding that's coming through the Department of Energy and making sure that we can protect the taxpayer and ensure that China is not getting funding from us.
So it would be subsequent to our letter?
Well, again, well, I don't know when your letter was.
October of 2022.
I don't know
You
exactly.
can get back to me. My
when it
time's up, but
Yeah,
you can get
for
back
sure.
to me. I'd appreciate it. Thank
You
you.
bet.
Gentlemen, time's expired. Now I'll go to Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Secretary Granholm, thank you for your leadership, outstanding leadership with the agency. Thank you to the department for all you're doing. You have been in my district, and they really believe in the efforts that you're making, and we see them as strong partnerships that will really get us to the transformation. You know, we hear a lot of talk today about a vision of a clean energy economy, and then the fundamentals of assets, resources, infrastructure, and the like. But it seems as though we part company where there's a message from some that will make certain that never happens, and others are messaging we're investing in the now and the future to make certain it happens. So study after study has found that the clean energy transition will require massive investments and build out of our electric grid, especially transmission lines, which we know can take close to a decade to get through the siting, permitting, and construction process. I would like to ask about some of the actions DOE is taking to accelerate these electric infrastructure projects. Yesterday, the White House permitting announcement confirmed that DOE has entered into an interagency memorandum of understanding using its authority under the Federal Power Act. So, Madam Secretary, can you inform us about anything happening with the MOU, and what is DOE's role as the lead federal agency for coordinating the authorization of these transmission lines?
Yes, so the memorandum of understanding involves several of the land agencies and those who do permitting and the Department of Energy. And under the Federal Power Act, Section 216H, it gives the Department of Energy the ability to set a time frame, a timetable for the granting and the processing of permits. And so we will be shepherding them with more rapidity.
Great. And how will this improved interagency coordination help permit transmission lines more quickly without sacrificing important environmental reviews?
Well, it's very important to make sure that we do the environmental reviews properly, but we can do them simultaneously. You don't have to wait to do a concurrent. And to get the agencies at the same table, on the same project, to identify what the barriers are and move through it quickly, to develop the mitigation strategies if they're necessary together, that helps to move things with greater speed.
Thank you. And offshore wind energy is also going to require major transmission planning and investments. Several studies have found that using a system of shared transmission infrastructure where multiple projects from different developers are connected offshore will be more cost-effective and less environmentally disruptive. Earlier this year, DOE released a major offshore transmission study which identified interoperability of electric equipment as a potential barrier to this vision of shared offshore infrastructure. So can DOE play a role working with project developers and transmission equipment manufacturers to support the development of standards to overcome these interoperability challenges?
Yes, and this is part of what the MOU sets up, is a way for us to work together with the private sector as well as the agencies to move more quickly. We did a study both on the Atlantic, and we're starting one now on the West Coast as well, so that we can have the same kind of speedy process and coordination.
Super. We also need to get more out of our existing infrastructure. Grid-enhancing technologies and reconductoring of existing lines can make them more efficient and reduce line loss. Building new infrastructure faster is critical, but what is DOE doing to ensure that we're getting the most out of the infrastructure that we already have in place?
Yes, I love this question because I do think it is one of the solutions to how we get around some of the NIMBY problems. So, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Grid Deployment Office has $5 billion for enhancements of grid technologies. Reconductoring is one of those, and we're hopeful that we get a number of applicants who are willing to use existing lines just to put twice as much power on them by using more efficient materials.
Great. Setting a great tone. Finally, on the Inflation Reduction Act, I know DOE is working hard to implement all the new programs, including electric appliance rebates for low and moderate income households. This program will be administered by state and tribal governments. Madam Secretary, can you provide any updates on when guidance for this program may be released? And can you discuss how DOE is working to provide support and tools to states so that their programs will be consistent and useful for both consumers and retailers?
Yes, very important. This is a new program, so we did a request for information to make sure we got the input of stakeholders, and that includes retailers, because we want the rebates to be taken at the point of sale. How quickly can we do that? What does that look like? Each state will be administering the rebate programs, and so we want to make sure we set up that guidance in a way that is very clear and consistent across states so that there's not a patchwork. That guidance and the rebate money will flow to the states this fall in order for it to be available for this winter season.
Thank you, and thank you for leading us into a transformational era. Thanks.
Gentleman, time's expired. I'll go now to the Chair of the Environmental Subcommittee, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, thank you for being here today. I want to discuss a pressing subject that both the Energy Subcommittee and my Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials Subcommittee have been working on for some time now, and that's the issue of critical minerals, rare earths, and the precarious nature of the supply chain. It's a national security issue. This is a defining challenge for policymakers here in the 21st century. So, Madam Secretary, for the record, do you agree that the United States needs to reduce its dependence on unfriendly nations and secure the supply chains for sometimes volatile global commodities like lithium, cobalt, graphite, and rare earths, among others?
I do.
Okay, great. Because that seems to contradict your remarks a couple of weeks ago before the Senate. Now, I truly wish we had time to get into your claim, for example, that in that Senate hearing that we can electrify the military by 2030. Because based on my 26-year Air Force career, I don't even know how to process that. But in your reasoning for this statement that you made, you said we need to bolster energy security by, quote, reducing our reliance on the volatility of globally traded fossil fuels. So, Madam Secretary, I'm trying to connect the dots. Are you telling us that dependence on globally traded fossil fuels is too volatile and dangerous for our military, therefore we should electrify, but somehow making our military dependent on other globally traded commodities and enormous additional amounts of lithium, cobalt, and rare earths is an improvement of some kind?
I believe we should have the full supply chain. No,
yes or no?
I mean, this, first of all, that was a question that was asked of me by Senator Ernst, and I was agreeing with what the military wanted.
Okay,
Because
but
they've
no, but
said-
I'm asking
Can I
you.
let me just finish this,
No,
though.
I don't want to
This is a really
filibuster,
important
Madam
clarification,
Secretary.
because they've
I don't
said
want to filibuster.
that the
I want you to answer
I'm
the
not
question.
filibustering, I'm clarifying.
Do you think that it is responsible to make the military dependent upon those volatile
No, I think
commodities?
the military
from
should be dependent on
But you
supply
said that
chains
in
from
that
here,
hearing. You
from
said
here.
they should-
No, you
you
won't
sh-
let me explain. That hearing, I believe what the military said, which is they believe they can electrify
well, you just
non-tactical
you just
vehicles.
confirmed that. So would
Non-tactical
you
vehicles
agree,
by 2035.
Madam Secretary,
and
reclaiming my
tactical
time, I'm asking the questions, please.
but
Would
you
you
won't let me
agree that these critical minerals are, in fact, volatile and controlled in many cases by unfriendly nations like China and could become scarce in a conflict? Do you agree with that?
right now, but that's
Okay,
why
great.
we have a strategy
So,
to be
Madam
able to
Secretary,
get
I actually agree
extraction
with you
here.
that we want to become more secure in all our critical energy resources. Let's produce more of it here at home.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is we have never, ever been as dependent on OPEC for oil than we are on China right now for the critical materials to do this electrification that you are advocating for. The 7-year time frame that you suggested to electrify the military is a recipe for further dangerous dependence on China for these materials that our military and civilian fleets of vehicles, for that matter, would need. So you told the Senate, we need to double down on the status quo and stop being dependent on volatile commodities like fossil fuels, but you just said that you want to secure the supply chain. So which is it? Because you can't do both.
Number one, I support the military's decision.
No, but
Try to go
I asked
electric
you a
by
different
2035.
question. I ask you a different question. Which
No, you
is
didn't.
it? Do you think
And number
we should
two,
be?
we
Do you
should
think
be
we should secure our supply chains, or do
Here,
you think
yes,
we should
I
be
do. And that's
dependent on
exactly
China?
what the president's agenda is allowing us to do, is
Well-
to both extract and process here in the United States.
You say one thing when you're over in the Senate, and you say another thing when you're over here, and your comments don't match, Madam Secretary, and that's what's confusing us.
unfortunately, you're twisting
It's
my
what's
words.
confusing the rest of the American people. For the record, would you commit to working with your agency and your experts to better study our dependence on critical energy resources and identify ways to increase production, refining, and processing of those critical materials right here at home?
We are doing that, and absolutely.
Okay, all right, thank you, Mr.
One point of
Chairman.
agreement.
Gentleman's time expired. Now go to Mr. Vesey from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Madam Secretary, last Congress, the bipartisan infrastructure law invested a historic $1.2 trillion in our nation's infrastructure, and the Inflation Reduction Act provided $369 billion in investments for growing domestic cleaner energy. These laws are already creating new jobs. They are already cutting costs for working families, and they're helping America be more competitive in this space. Under no circumstances, absolutely under no circumstances, do we want China to be the leaders in this space, particularly with the world being so thirsty for a lot of these newer technologies. And so I thank you for being here today to answer these questions. And before I get specifically to mine, I wanted to give you the opportunity to take 30 seconds to clarify your position on the question that Mr. Johnson was asking you.
Number one, I support the military's goal of electrifying the non-tactical vehicles by 2035 and the tactical vehicles by 2050. That's a goal. I support the generals. Number two, I also support the bringing of the supply chain for batteries home so that we are reliant on us, on our land, on our processing, and on our workers to make us energy independent.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. In the Carbon Management Liftoff Report the department released a few weeks ago, your department estimated that the U.S. could need up to 1.8 billion tons per year of CO2 removal by 2050, and right now we only have 20 million. Can you talk about how carbon removal programs that were authorized under the Energy Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law are helping create a domestic carbon removal industry that will be necessary to help us get to that scale of carbon renewal in just 27 years?
Yes, and thank you for your leadership on this. The SCALE Act, obviously, providing such an impetus for us to be able to use the Loan Program Office to be able to fund the infrastructure necessary for carbon, the movement of CO2, as well as the sequestration of it. And to be able to finance that in a large-scale manner is very important. In addition, the ability to be able to finance and pay for the sequestration at $85 per ton is critical for us to create that market. So we have both now supply and demand and the ability to be able to move it. That we're working on all at once, but that market is essential for us to get to our decarbonization goals.
Absolutely. And I also want to zero in on the Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, which I secured the inclusion within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Can you talk a little bit about LPL's implementation of that program and when we might start to see the first loans being put out for that program?
Yeah, it's my understanding that there have been several applicants for that provision to be able, and they're in discussions now with the Loan Programs Office. The loan programs process is very rigorous, and we want it to be. And so we hope that we will be able to see some announcements later this year.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We're just trying to calculate, votes have just been called, we're trying to calculate based on your hard break and members coming back. We're going to go ahead and take another couple of questions before members have to go, and then I'm going to talk with staff. I now recognize Mr. Bouchon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Granholm. Thanks for being here. I do want to clarify something about you saying that the generals want to do, is that the generals work for the President of the United States, and the ones that don't agree with the President of the United States get replaced by people who do agree with the President of the United States. So for the American people should know that high-level generals that are running the DOD in an administration are people that, in general, politically agree with the commander-in-chief, or they're replaced by someone who does. So I just think it's really, anytime a political party says that tries to use our military as a reason they're doing something and like it's their expertise, yes, it is their expertise, but they agree. These level people you're talking about agree with the commander-in-chief, or they wouldn't be in their job. That's just, just don't do that. As I've stated before, I'm strongly supportive of an all-above energy approach. Look, we need reliable, affordable energy, and we obviously need to decrease our carbon emissions. I think that's a goal that we all have. I just believe that it should be about emissions, not about source. And America's future, we have to have affordable, reliable, sustainable energy that is cleaner, no doubt, and will require a diverse energy mix. Have you been recently in Europe or talked to any of your European counterparts in Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, anywhere in Eastern Europe? And are you aware of what's happening in Eastern Europe related to the fact that they've all now recognized that it's a bad idea to be dependent on energy sources from countries that don't like you?
Absolutely.
Well, then you must have a different interpretation of what they've said than I did, because I was just there with Chair Rogers. And, if you go to the European Union, they're true believers in global warming. The ministers there, I understand that. But when you actually talk to the countries who are at risk of losing their national security based on energy insecurity, what they told us, they're rapidly looking for alternatives to Russian fuel. And guess where they're looking in the short term? They're going back to coal that they have, or they are going to rely on LNG imports from around the world, and it's going to, from what they had on their clean energy agenda before, set Europe back by a decade or more on that goal, because they were short-sighted and didn't take an all-the-above approach, and now they've shut down all their nuclear plants, and they no longer can rely on Russian gas. Although there were protests in Europe, some people loyal to the Russians that want the European countries to start importing cheap Russian gas. This creates an international instability. The United States cannot put ourselves in a position of being reliant on foreign sources of energy while shutting down our own energy resources in this country, and that's what this administration is doing by all the things they're doing to their rush to green, to eliminate fossil fuel in the short run and the long run. And what we should be doing is focusing on emissions and not source. And if we don't do that, we're going to end up just like they are over there, scrambling, wondering whether they can keep the lights on and the heat on in the winter. It's just, it just, when these hearings, when I hear my colleagues like yourself and on the other side of the aisle talk about this, your plans are not doable. Almost everybody we talk to in Europe has now recognized that. It's just not doable without considering an all of the above energy approach, including fossil and nuclear and others. And so so the Energy Information Administration, I will have one quick question. The way their modeling doesn't work. So what do you plan to do to update the EIA modeling capabilities to be sure they can provide policymakers and the public accurate information on energy supplies, demand, and related issues central to the administration's agenda and our policymaking decisions.
Well, I would disagree that they don't work. I mean,
Well, we have, okay.
are
so
experts.
Okay,
And-
so we've had modeling both on climate and all kinds of things for decades, right? And they've been wrong, all of it's been wrong.
Well, I don't know that all of it has been wrong, but these are
Well, the data
economists and
shows that they're all
experts
wrong.
that know what they're doing in terms of modeling, and they use very sophisticated tools
Okay.
to do so.
Fair enough. We're going to risk the energy future and national security of the United States based on computer scientists sitting at a computer modeling things that have been shown not to work. I yield back.
Chairman yields back, and now we'll go to Ms. Custer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Secretary Granholm, for taking the time to testify before this committee. Before I dive into questions, I want to thank you for your efforts to ensure that the hydropower grant program created in the bipartisan infrastructure law reflects Congress's intent. As you know, Section 247, Maintaining and Enhancing Hydroelectricity Incentive Programs, provides grants to hydropower owners to make dam safety, grid resiliency, and environmental improvements at the facilities. I appreciate your willingness to resolve issues around the draft guidance in the final version to maximize the benefits from these dollars to help preserve the existing hydropower fleet. So thank you for that. Secretary Granholm, I want to start my questions by talking about two things we need to achieve our clean energy goals: new clean energy generation and long-duration energy storage. One way to build out new clean electricity generation is to retrofit some of our 90,000 dams with hydropower generation. According to the DOE's analysis, retrofitting non-powered dams could add 12 gigawatts of reliable, renewable energy to the grid, enough electricity to power 12 million homes. In addition to building new clean energy generation, we need long-duration energy storage. Pump storage hydropower is a proven long-duration energy storage technology. There's already 23 gigawatts of pump storage on the grid and more than 100 gigawatts in the pipeline. But retrofitting a non-powered dam with hydropower or building a new pump storage facility can be very expensive. The Inflation Reduction Act provides a 30% investment tax credit for the next 10 years to help developers retrofit non-powered dams with hydropower generation and build new pump storage projects. Madam Secretary, can you speak to how repealing the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act would impact the domestic hydropower and pump storage industries?
Yeah, it would be devastating for the industry. I mean, we are just at a point now where we're starting to get the investment decisions to be able to add capacity at dams. And this is clean, dispatchable baseload power that has black start capability. It's 93% of our pump storage is 93% of our storage, utility scale storage. We absolutely have to accelerate the use of hydroelectric power.
Great, thank you so much. Rather than spending our time rolling back tax credits for hydropower and pump storage, I think we should focus on improving the licensing process for hydropower facilities. According to analysis by NREL, on average, it can take between 7 to 10 years to relicense a hydropower facility. Licensing pump storage can take even longer. Madam Secretary, as Congress considers permitting reform legislation, should we also evaluate ways we can improve the licensing process for hydropower and pump storage facilities?
Absolutely.
Final question. I was proud to see that Mascoma Valley Regional School in my district won an Energy Class Prize to lower energy costs and improve indoor air quality. How can Congress best support the Department of Energy's work to foster healthier learning environments in our schools?
Well, one of the things you have done is to give the Department of Energy the ability to incentivize more energy efficient work at schools, at public schools all across the country. We have a funding opportunity announcement out, huge response to it. Love to see more of that so more schools can benefit.
Great, and next time you're in New Hampshire, I invite you to come see the impact of that award on Mascoma Valley Regional School. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back with 1 minute to spare.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back, and we'll go to Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Granholm, for coming here today. I've seen one analysis that shows that DOE will spend at least $150 billion over the next 5 years, maybe significantly more. In your budget request, you use the term equity 137 times. President Biden issued an executive order directing the federal government to spend money that is, quote, consistent with applicable law to allocate resources to address the historic failure to invest sufficiently, justly, and equally in underserved communities, unquote. You have been directed to spend $150 billion by Congress. Will you provide to this committee the specific applicable law passed by Congress that allows these dollars to be spent in a manner to address the historic failure to invest sufficiently, justly, and equally in underserved communities?
One of the laws is through the Inflation Reduction Act. There is a low-income adder that allows for, it's an additional incentive, a 10% incentive for those who are building out solar, for example, facilities to locate in communities that have been disproportionately affected, perhaps by negatively by pollution, or have been a disadvantaged community economically.
DOE's Justice 40 initiative requires 40% of spending to go towards disadvantaged communities. Can you provide me with a specific applicable law passed by Congress that allows such a massive quota system?
It is a goal. It's Justice 40, that 40% should be directed to communities that have been left behind, that have not had the benefit of the investments that other communities have. So we are trying to achieve that goal, and part of that is through community benefit agreements associated with the grants that we are providing under the bipartisan infrastructure law. We want those who are investing to be able to consult with communities to make sure that there is a workforce strategy.
So you say it's in the infrastructure law?
Infrastructure law and the
language.
Inflation Reduction Act both provide incentives for locating facilities in disadvantaged communities.
Madam Secretary, you, I think, already know that I'm sponsoring a bill, Save Our Stoves, Gas Stoves Act. So far, we have 55 co-sponsors, and it has bipartisan support. And 29 of my Democratic colleagues voted for a similar amendment, in fact, it was stoves. I wrote a letter with 70 other members and submitted our comments for the record on your rulemaking that would ban gas stoves and effectively ban gas stoves in America. I think it's unfortunate that we have to introduce a bill to reverse an unnecessary anti-consumer choice rule by Department of Energy. On DOE's website, it states, it claims that the federal government is banning gas stoves are absurd. Yet, here are the facts that I know. DOE's first approach was to set a requirement of the proposed rule at max tech requirements, which DOE itself said would eliminate 96% of the products available today. Setting a max tech requirement has never been done before for household appliances. After pushback, it appears that DOE revised their information and subsequently determined half of the products would be eliminated from the market. It appears DOE pulled this number, quite frankly, out of thin air. I don't know where you got it from. They started counting products on a website that looked like products it tested. DOE, of course, has no actual basis for knowing if the products it found meet its proposed standard because it did not test them. To date, DOE provides no data or substantiation for how it determined the models on retailer websites would meet its proposed standards. This proposed rule puts at risk at least 1,000 manufacturing jobs in just one company in Arizona. And quite frankly, it eliminates consumer choice. According to DOE's own estimate, the rule will save only $21.89 per stove over a 14-year period, or $1.50 per year, or 12 cents a month. And then DOE said somehow that equates to a saving of $1.7 billion. Finally, the projected gas emissions reduction is equivalent to about 8 hours of Chinese coal plant emissions. And so my statement is, why in the world would we want to increase funding for the Department of Energy when it appears that they're going after consumer choice and, quite frankly, Americans? Thank you, and I yield back.
Generally yields back. Go to Ms. Schreier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Madam Secretary. Thank you for your service. There are a few topics I'd like to touch on today, but I also want to make sure I give you an opportunity to set the record straight on anything you feel like you haven't had an opportunity to be clear about. The topics I wanted to touch on are small modular nuclear reactors, hydrogen hubs, and in Hanford, and I'll try to be brief so you have an opportunity. There is consensus in this committee that nuclear energy is a big part of the solution if we want to curb greenhouse gas emissions and have a clean energy portfolio. And I was really pleased to see additional funding announced this week to help with the deployment of small modular nuclear reactors. Pacific Northwest National Lab also suggests that this is incredibly important that we have them factory fabricated, delivered on trucks, affordable. And I just wanted you to comment on how do we make this happen in the time frame that we need it to happen in?
First of all, super important that we continue the research and development on these advanced reactors. Super important that we continue to get them licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we have a process issue that we want to continue to accelerate and continue to do the research. It also is very important that we have the fuel for these small modular reactors, and that means HALEU, and that means we have to have a national strategy on a uranium strategy for both our larger nuclear fleet as well as these advanced reactors. That is something I hope I can work with you and the committee on.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I know that Canada can be a significant source for us, a friendly next-door neighbor nation. But I also saw that there was investment in looking for alternative fuels, and so I appreciate those investments. On that topic, in kind of that same vein, alternative fuels to use, or materials to use in batteries in addition to lithium. Do you have any comments on that?
The labs are all working on substitutes, lithium, but also substitutes for some of the other materials that are critical minerals that we may rely upon other nations for. So that I was mentioning earlier that manganese is something that we are researching. Our Critical Minerals Institute at our Ames laboratory is looking at a whole slew of potential substitutes, as well as getting critical minerals from tailings of coal separation, from uranium. We want to make sure that we are looking at all potential sources, and I would say including recycling of batteries that currently exist, because that is a circular economy solution that is very promising.
Thank you. We've had a hearing in here with companies who are ready to do that recycling. Second, I wanted to put in just another plug for Washington State as a possible hub for green hydrogen. We have abundant hydropower. We also have solar and wind, and ultimately, green hydrogen is our ultimate goal, far better than blue or gray because of zero fossil fuel, zero greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, I just wanted to thank you for your commitment for work at Hanford and working with our state and to achieve our goals and the administration's goals, and I appreciate your help. The floor is yours. You have a minute and a half to set the record straight on anything you'd like.
You know what? I don't know that it's necessary. I will say that the Department of Energy is not banning any gas stoves, that we are doing our duty to make sure that appliances are more energy efficient, as we are required to do under the Energy Policy Conservation Act of 1975. We regulate and add efficiency standards to 60 appliances. This is one. It was required by a consent decree, and nobody's taking my gas stove. Nobody will take your gas stove. But in the future, gas stoves that are high-end, which is all that we looked at, the high-end gas stoves can be more efficient, and the cost for making a high-end gas stove efficient is about $12.
Sounds like a great investment with a good payoff. I yield back.
She yields back. I'll go to Mr. Balderson from Ohio for 5 minutes. And this is going to be the last one, then we're going to break for votes and come back immediately after.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Nice to meet you. Last year, the Senate Democrats unveiled electric transmission permitting reform provisions that were included in a broader permitting bill. This transmission provision included language to socialize the cost of new projects and give FERC enhanced transmission siting and permitting authority. The same language was just introduced the other week in the Senate. Regarding electric transmission siting and permitting, you recently stated community input is important in all of this. We have to be very intentional about that, and we've got a team that is focused on that as well. Do you believe granting FERC more authority to unilaterally site and permit electric transmission lines is consistent with the principle of community input as you previously have stated?
Are you talking about the backstop authority? that
Yes.
FERC got? Yes, I do, because I think you can do both. You can have FERC issue the backstop authority, but you do it in a sensitive way,
Okay.
including in community.
Is granting FERC more authority to impose cost socialization of new transmission infrastructure to those who do not directly benefit from increased reliability or lower costs consistent with the principle of community input?
I think communities need transmission, and the fact that the interconnection queues are completely backed up and that we need to have a cost allocation strategy that is fair is very important.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, I understand that 9 federal agencies, including the Department of Energy, have signed a MOU on facilitating federal authorizations for electric transmission facilities. This MOU states there is a strong public interest in increasing coordination across federal agencies to expand our nation's electric transmission infrastructure. I'm curious why there's such strong interest in increasing coordination, reducing bureaucracy, and moving forward with these projects, but not doing the same when it comes to interstate pipelines or nuclear energy projects, which are more essential for grid reliability and for America to meet our energy needs. Has the Department of Energy signed a similar MOU for coordination on pipeline or nuclear energy projects with other federal agencies?
No.
Why?
Well, the grid and the transmission grid has been utterly and ridiculously lengthy. It is true that takes a long time for these others to get permitted as well. We are very much in favor of ensuring that we have, as I was discussing earlier, pipelines for a variety of things, including CO2 as well as hydrogen. We also want to see expedited movement on nuclear, especially these small modular reactors and the micro reactors that could be used to decarbonize heavy industry.
Okay. Secretary, in your testimony, you note that the administration supports the use of the Defense Production Act to support rebuilding domestic uranium production, as well as other clean energy technologies to ensure robust supply chains for electrical transformers and other critical grid components. The Inflation Reduction Act provided significant funding to carry out the Defense Production Act with almost no strings attached. The administration decided to give your department $250 million of these funds to accelerate electric heat pump manufacturing. If the administration supports using the Defense Production Act to rebuild uranium production and improve supply chains for electrical transformers and critical grid components, why did President Biden choose to use the DPA funds for your department entirely on electric heat pumps?
I would say that if we do a uranium strategy, it's going to require a good deal amount more than that, and then even the $700 million that we initially got under the Defense Production Act. We need a comprehensive strategy, and I hope we can work with you on it.
Okay. My last thing is kind of just a statement, but I'm going to run out of time. I want to discuss, it's part of this, the GOES and the replace the grain or electrical steel piece for the transformer. So I'll send this question in to you because I don't want to go over my time. So I appreciate you being here, and we'll get that over to you. Thank you.
All right, the committee will stand in recess, and we will reconvene immediately following the last vote. All right. The subcommittee will be back in order, and I'll now recognize Mr. Wahlberg from Michigan for 5 minutes. And thank you for your patience, Madam Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michiganians and Michiganders are very patient people. We share that, don't we, Madam Secretary?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here. And you and I agree on some things, and we don't agree on other things, but that's the way it goes. I've been listening throughout the hearing thus far, and one thing that just became at least clear to me was that with IRA and IIJA and all of the forward good thoughts about what this can produce, that's still in the expectation realm. You know, I look back at what we did in the last administration. There's a case history of energy independence, lowered emissions, which I think we agree on. We want to lower the emissions, and lower prices at the pump and otherwise. And so that's, I think, where the concern comes when we see some of the projected savings, experiences. We know what worked, and a concern about what we're going forward. So with the recent EPA emission rules, over 2/3 of the new vehicles have to be at all electric in less than 10 years. I know you've said in the past that the rules don't specify what type of vehicle technology, and we hope there is flexibility that remains there. But the OEMs who have been unwilling to stand up and say, we can't do this, and I've jumped on them plenty, Ford and GM and Stellantis most recently, and I've lauded Toyota for being willing to look at some alternatives. I worry with the massive increase in EVs, in addition to other forced electrification coming out of your agency and the EPA. Our electric grid will not be able to keep it. I think I can say it won't be able to keep up right now. In going about my new district that goes from Lake Michigan and the Cook nuclear plant and the mothballing of the Palisades plant that's taking place now, all the way over to Lake Erie with Fermi 1 and 2, and Fermi that has a third license that they spent millions of dollars to get, but they've told me because of permitting, because of cost, they're probably not going to do that. So I look at nuclear capabilities, and there's concerns there. This also comes with the new regulations coming out of the administration last night, talking about emissions being cut by 90% or close to that. Today I heard from a constituent company who said they were prepared to put 4 EV chargers at their filling station, convenience store, but the local utility ultimately came in and said, you can't do it, we can only give you 1 because we don't have capacity. And I could go down the list, and you've heard the same concerns. I heard something new today that a similar company relative to transporting fossil fuels, oil, specifically gasoline, to areas where they've had disaster, hurricane or whatever. FEMA has expressed concerns on meeting emergency needs without fossil fuel capacities and capabilities because you can't carry a 20-gallon drum of electricity and even getting the trucks there. So those are, I guess, preface to my concern about how is the Department of Energy planning to offset both this increase in demand and decrease in supply being forced by administration policies?
Thank you. First, this is and it must be, a managed and thoughtful transition. And it's why these are all proposed rules, and we want to hear from industry so that we get it right and that we don't end up creating insecurity on the grid. Super important. I will say that, for example, in Michigan, the Palisades plant, there is hopefully an effort to try to revive that. That will be coming through our loan program office. So we're hopeful that that will not reduce supply, and we need more nuclear online. This, what you've just described with Fermi is new to me, so I'm going to dig into that a little bit. However, I will say this too. One of the things we have not discussed here, and I think that's important, is the electrification of the vehicle fleet is also an opportunity to have virtual power plants to allow for the batteries. This is why all of the OEMs care about bidirectional charging, to have the batteries of those vehicles end up having a conversation with the grid when times are tight.
But
And that's an opportunity.
That's a hope for the future. And right now, they're making their assumptions, they're making their plans based upon what we're talking about. And that's why, Madam Secretary, I think we ought to be cautious. We ought to talk with great flexibility before we start putting percentages and time frames on. I think we're capable through innovation. We've shown that. We cleaned up our environment to a great degree, better than any other country in the world with natural gas. So I've run over my time, and so I must say also, any help you can give us on Line 5. You knew I would bring that up.
I knew you had to.
We
Gentleman's
have to
time's
have help.
expired.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Granholm, for being here with us today and for serving our country so well. Thank you so much for your service. Last Congress, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act authorized the programs and funding necessary to meaningfully address the climate crisis. These two complementary laws have already accelerated our nation's transition to a clean energy economy powered by American workers, manufacturers, and innovators. We're now beginning to see the impacts of these bills in job creation, clean power, and cost savings for families. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are taking steps to undo the strides Democrats made in lowering energy costs for American families, undoing our nation's legacy of environmental injustice, and transitioning our nation to a clean energy economy. That includes pushing the Default on America Act, which would repeal environmental review processes and keep provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act. Republicans have chosen a path that would further line the pockets of big oil as they continue to push their the polluters over people agenda. As we look to deliver for the American people, we must preserve these victories for our economy, workforce, environment, and our children and children's future. As we know, the budget is a reflection of our values, and I'm heartened to see that the Department of Energy is looking to build off the major accomplishments of the last Congress. To deliver on climate action equitably, the Inflation Reduction Act advances the Justice 40 initiative, which sets to deliver 40% of investments to disadvantaged communities that have been hurt by polluters for generations. Secretary Granholm, what is the department doing to advance Justice 40?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's, as you know, it's the first executive order that the president signed, and it is part of this administration's DNA across agencies. For us, for example, what it means is that when we are offering a grant program, say the hydrogen hubs as an example, that those who are coming to seek the grant have to demonstrate that they have a community benefits agreement, that the community's at the table and helping to craft it so that they get the benefit of the good instead of obviously being the victims of the bad, which has been the case. The combination of the community benefits agreement and the incentives that are embedded in the IIJA to incentivize the location of good projects in communities that have been disadvantaged is a really strong 1-2 punch to ensure that the communities are at the table.
So the administration is looking to do this in a way that creates more equitable and accessible future for all communities?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of communities, I happen to have been elected to represent the community that I grew up in, the side of town where we have more dump sites in LA County than any other place in the 10 million person county of Los Angeles. I was the first one to represent that community. I'm very proud to say that I was the first elected official to say no to a landfill expansion. That the first permit said that they're gonna put trash in the ground, very deeply into the ground, up to grade. And by the time I got elected, they had so many permits that they were above 100 feet above the ground. The children in the community called it a mountain. It was just a mountain of trash that came from all parts of Los Angeles, but was dumped on our side of town. So we cannot do all the wonderful work that you're getting done soon enough for communities like the one that I grew up in and that I'm so blessed to represent. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act prioritize building out our nation's workforce by creating good-paying union jobs. This has also been under attack. Most recently in H.R. 1, the Republicans sought to repeal home energy efficiency contractor training grants that we had included in the Inflation Reduction Act. However, to strengthen our nation's economy and transition into clean energy, it's vital that we build our nation's workforce, and we must do so in a way that prioritizes diversity and good-paying jobs that families can sustain themselves on. Secretary Granholm, what steps in the department is the department taking to increase workforce training opportunities for communities of color, low-income communities, and non-traditional students?
We're doing a bunch of things, but let me just specify one that is really important, which is these community benefit agreements that I'm talking about. They're weighted in the evaluation of the proposal, 20% that has to demonstrate that the community's there. And part of that includes workforce training for the specific project that may be coming to that area, number one. And number two, ensuring that there are apprenticeship opportunities for those so they can earn while they learn, so that we can have the next generation as well, building out whether it's trades or the specialized kind of work that's necessary in these advanced energy projects. So we're excited about being able to bring everybody along.
I exceeded my time. I apologize, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now go to the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Mr. Curtis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary. My compliments for being here. My compliments for your interaction with me and our caucus. I think the first step to overcoming differences is communication and working together, and I'm one who really appreciates your efforts to reach out to us. I also advocate frequently that we actually agree on far more than it sometimes sounds like between different parties here. One of those vast areas, I think, of agreement is nuclear, and we've had that quite a bit discussed today, but I'd like to discuss a specific project. Thank you for DOE's historic commitment to the carbon-free power project. I have an organization, UAMPS. It actually is Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems. I had to look it up myself because we all know it as UAMPS, who is 10 years through a permitting process, about halfway through and $100 million into it. Couldn't do it without the help of DOE, and this is a big load on municipalities to finance this. And so I'm grateful for your support. This is a big deal if we're able to complete this project. And that said, I'm a little concerned about the overall amount of money towards advanced small nuclear reactors, and wanted to kind of hear from you DOE's position and commitment to these small nuclear reactors, which clearly, I think by everybody's standards, needs to be part of our energy future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that it absolutely does. I know we have $10 million in there for the UAMPS program, and I know it has been given hundreds of millions over the past years, but we are totally committed to small modular reactors, advanced reactors, and the technologies that are going to not just help the United States, but around the world. We know that we've got allies in countries like in Eastern Europe, et cetera, that are very interested in these technologies, and we want to develop them here. We want to have them made in America, but we also want to be able to export them.
Clearly, we should all agree on the fact that we want it made here in America,
Yes.
right, and export it.
Another point of 100% agreement.
Yeah, another point
I
of
hope.
agreement, right, that we all agree on. So, and it's been brought up today, but let me just touch on this, Russia being the available source for advanced nuclear fuel. It feels to me like, on one hand, we're trying to get permitting reform in place so we can build all these nuclear facilities, and yet, if we do that, we may not have the fuel.
Yeah.
Can you address that? And
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think we have to work on in a bipartisan fashion is a uranium strategy. What we have developed is a proposal for a $2.1 billion uranium strategy that would allow for a revolving fund so that we could finance the conversion, enrichment, et cetera, all the steps here in the United States. We're hopeful. We got $700 million as a down payment of that, but we're hopeful to be able to work with Congress to fully fund that, perhaps in an NDAA or in a supplemental or whatever, because I think it's really important that we do that if we are to wean ourselves from reliance upon Russian uranium.
yeah, so we're building this facility, and will we have the halo, right, in
Right.
place when this is done, I think. And I don't know
Well,
if you have any
as you're
specific
probably
comments
aware,
on-
that we are at H Canyon we are down blending highly enriched uranium to get HALEU for the advanced reactors that we have, but it's not going to last long enough. We need a long-term strategy.
So thank you. I'd like to turn to maybe an area where there's not as much agreement, but still vast agreement. I heard my colleague, Mr. Wahlberg, talk about EVs. And I think sometimes when, as Republicans, we ask questions, we're viewed as not supporting or not wanting solar or wind or EVs and things like that. And I don't think it's the case, but I do think we have questions, right? And we want answers. I happened to read a Wall Street Journal article today that pointed out that Rivian Automotive is going to lose this quarter $75,000 on every vehicle sold. And the value of their company is given $98,000 for every car it expects to sell. But Lucid, their value of the company is $1.2 million for every car that they expect to sell. So sometimes you see when we hear these things, this is why we bring up questions. And sometimes I think it's perceived as, well, we just don't want EVs. But I think, I'd just really like to point out, there's a practical part of this that we want answers. How are we going to charge these? Where is the grid going to come from? Where's the electricity going to come from? This isn't even speaking to the $7,500 credit. So I don't know if you have a comment on that. It was just a point I wanted to make.
Well, I would say that this is why we have these 17 jewels, which are the national labs that are expert at modeling all of these different scenarios. And you are right to ask the questions. And it's important to ask the questions, and it's important to get the right answers from those who have expertise.
Thank you.
And
Madam Chair, I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record EV startups are proving Warren Buffett right, Wall Street Journal today.
Without objection, so ordered. And the chair will now go to Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Granholm, welcome.
Thank you.
You're definitely in the eye of the energy transition storm, but doing a terrific job in managing that transition on behalf of our government, so thanks so much. It's so vital that we stay at the forefront of the evolving energy industry and developing clean energy technology, and the workforce critically to implement it is going to spur tremendous economic growth, as you know, while also promoting our environmental and our national security interests. But we know that those interests are impacted by the much larger global marketplace, of course. And for more than a year now, we've witnessed an upheaval in global energy security in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Despite these challenges, many of our European allies have stepped up to the plate to reduce dependence on Russian energy sources. Could you describe some of the recent steps that DOE has taken to bolster European energy security in partnership with our allies?
Yeah, for sure. Number one, we have obviously done a lot of exporting of liquefied natural gas, which has been, I think, a great save to many of them. We have partnered with them on developing strategies for hydrogen and to systematize the standards related to it so that there can be international trade of clean hydrogen. We have worked with them on, especially the Eastern Europeans, on advanced nuclear, and have partnered with them on, for example, Westinghouse going to Poland to be able to build several of their reactors going forward. All of their focus on diversifying energy supply, we have been in tandem with them, both on the technology side as well as on the deployment to the extent that we can. I will say we've learned from them too. Offshore wind efforts that have, that the UK and the Northern Europeans have engaged in have been very instructive for us as we consider our own offshore wind strategy. So it's been a mutual arrangement.
And on that score, in Maryland, we've got some really exciting developments in terms of offshore wind production with some of those international partners being in the mix. We have Eastern Mediterranean allies like Greece and Cyprus and Israel who are playing a very critical role in these efforts, the ones that we're discussing, as you know. And Congress recognized this when it passed the bipartisan Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act a few years back. And in that, we authorized the establishment of the United States Eastern Mediterranean Energy Center. The center's goal will be to leverage, quote, the experience, knowledge, and expertise of institutions of higher education and entities in the private sector, among others, to identify opportunities for energy development in the region. Establishing the U.S. Eastern Mediterranean Energy Center will both facilitate the development of cutting-edge clean energy solutions and promote Europe's energy diversification in accordance with our economic and national security interests. Could you maybe just comment on why establishing the U.S. Mediterranean Center is so important for international energy policy, and what resources you think might be necessary to get that center off the ground?
Yeah, thanks for that, too. I think that across the Mediterranean, there is so much happening and so important to solidify the relationships, especially around energy, because of its critical nexus where it is in the world and the desire to wean ourselves from energy from Russia. That particular center, the concept of a center, is super important. I know that we've been authorized to be able to establish it, and looking forward to an appropriation, and I know there's been a suggestion about a $10 million appropriation. Our International Affairs Office is in the middle of drafting a concept paper of what this would look like, but the bottom line is the various points of energy, whether it's wind or offshore wind or clean hydrogen transported via ship, or solar, obviously, or advanced small reactors, you name it, that region is a fundamental part of our ability to partner with Europe to become energy independent.
Great, and we look forward to working with you on that. We are seeking the appropriations. I've got 30 seconds left, so just on another topic real quick. A lot of focus on sort of technology as a way of sequestering carbon. But can you speak to your perspective on making sure we have a good balance of sort of biological solutions in terms of dealing with climate change alongside of technological solutions?
Yeah, we have to do biological solutions. We have to do earth-based solutions. We have to do technological solutions. We have to do everything, everywhere, all at once.
Great, thanks very much. I yield back.
Okay, the chair will go to Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Secretary Granholm, I'm very encouraged by your support for next generation nuclear. I think it is our best option, best opportunity for transitioning to a emissions-free, well, it won't be emissions-free because there's emissions involved in the construction, but there are a number of reasons why I think this is the direction we ought to go. One, we can recycle spent fuel rods. France is doing that. They use a standard design on their nuclear reactors, which I think helps reduce the cost of the reactors themselves, reduces maintenance costs, but they operate 24/7, where with wind and solar, it's intermittent power. And I worked for 2 international engineering companies prior to running a think tank for 20-something years. And we cannot have the economic growth that we want to have. We cannot be able to support the emergence of economies in poor countries with just trying to rely on intermittent power. And as I was saying, what the nuclear facilities will do for us is 24/7 power generation, except when you shut them down for maintenance. Their operational life cycle will be approximately 80 years, which Lord knows where we'll be with technology in 80 years. But the other thing that I think we need to take note of is that you can site one next-generation nuclear facility on 640 acres. It's about the same amount of space you'd use for a natural gas facility. But to generate the same amount of power from that nuclear facility from a turbine farm would require 77,000 acres. And I think you understand the problems we're running into with not in my backyard, with potentially and a very aggressive use of eminent domain, which I really don't think we want to go that direction. So my other concern is about this, and you can address this, is there really isn't a scenario where we're going to be net zero by 2050. The physics don't work, the economics don't work, and the technology doesn't work. Now, it's not to say in the next 20 or so years that the technology won't improve, but there really isn't a way to get there. So it is encouraging to me to see the emphasis on next generation nuclear, and particularly since we can recycle spent fuel rods. The director of the National Nuclear Laboratory was here week before last, I think it was, Mr. Chairman, and I asked him if he'd done any calculations to determine how long we could operate these nuclear reactors using the fuel that's stored now, and he said 100 years. So we don't have to depend on anybody. The other thing that I want to address is my concern. I know my Democrat colleagues are very dismissive of what we're trying to do with H.R. 1. They're very dismissive of some of the issues that we've brought up about China. I do not believe the existential threat to the world is climate change. I think it's China. And in that regard, I'm very concerned about how much we will be dependent on China for our energy resources. And I've said this many, many times, that the war in Ukraine did not create the energy crisis, it exposed it. It exposed the fact that we've spent a decade and a half neglecting our hydrocarbon infrastructure, particularly natural gas. But it's also instructive that no nation should be dependent on an adversarial nation for anything as important to its economy and its national security as energy. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I couldn't agree more that we should not be reliant upon countries whose values we don't share for our own energy resources. And that's why the importance of the Invest in America agenda, the Inflation Reduction Act, has caused all of these companies doing critical mineral processing and battery supply chain work to come to the United States, to build up our supply chain here so that we are energy independent. I think we could probably all agree that it's important to build up our own supply chain so that we are energy independent.
My point is, we don't have to do that for nuclear.
I'm agreeing with you on nuclear.
We've got a major problem with permitting. It will take years to get us where we need to be on the critical minerals. I'm fine with renewables, but there's certain physics that come into play here. You cannot sustain the economy that we have, much less grow the economy that we need to grow with intermittent power. Europe is starting to wake up to this. So I think we need truly an all of the above, but we should not cast aside our hydrocarbon resources in this mad dash, which I think is rather mad to think that we've got to do all this in such a short amount of time when we really don't. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. And I thank you for testifying and for you holding this hearing.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll go to Ms. Blunt Rochester for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Granholm, for attending today's hearing. On behalf of my state and region, I'd like to thank you and the department for moving forward with the Hydrogen Hub program, which will help create more jobs and ensure an effective transition to clean energy. Last month, the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub, also known as MACH2, submitted its application to become one of those hubs, and the proposal will transform the energy economy of the state of Delaware and spur massive job growth for my constituents. And I urge you, Madam Secretary, to ensure that small states like Delaware are also able to benefit from this program. I'd also like to thank you for your testimony's attention to supply chain resiliency. My bill, the Supply Chains Act, would help us solve these problems across the economy, including the energy sector. And I'd love to follow up with you in the future to discuss this legislation. Glad also to have you here, and I heard the conversation with Representative Cardenas about the efforts of the administration to focus not only on clean energy jobs, but also union jobs, apprenticeships, also the focus on Justice 40. I can say from my own constituents how grateful they are for that work and that attention, that focus. And in your testimony, you noted that $70 million and a $70 million investment for community capacity building initiatives to address areas of persistent poverty. This issue has come up repeatedly when I'm talking to folks about the implementation of major bills like the IRA or the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so can you just speak a little bit about what that investment means, what it would do, the intention of it? I'd love to hear more about that, and also how it ties to the persistent poverty issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about policy mattering is that when you adopt great legislation and craft it in the right way, then it can go to the populations that you really need it. So I think as an example of weatherization, you and I were at a weatherization event. There has been enhancements to the weatherization program that are specific that will impact significantly impoverished communities. For example, allowing impoverished communities to install not just weatherization, but also solar generation, for example, on homes, allowing those who live in manufactured housing to take advantage of those. So we have a state and community energy program that is as a result of trying to administer these programs where DOE meets the street, if you will, and making sure we are thoughtful about crafting our outreach and our programs to communities that have been left behind, communities that are fence line communities, has been a big part of our efforts in our administration of our Justice 40 goals.
Yeah, I really want to zero in as well on making sure that dollars get to the communities that need it most, but also that they have the capacity to do it.
Yes.
That's one of the things that I've heard most back from constituents is, I don't know how to do this kind of grant application. I've never done this before. And so that capacity building part is really, really vital, I think, in this moment.
And I would say streamlining process so that they don't have to do a huge funding opportunity.
Exactly.
Maybe they do a concept paper. Maybe you reduce the amount of cost share. All of those are what we're considering as we administer these grant programs.
I mean, for me, I think about this from a jobs perspective. I think about it from a health perspective. There are so many pieces to, and then there's the justice impact of it as well. So thank you for that. I think we've talked before as well about the efforts to upscale retrofitting, like home performance programs to include large public buildings, and I'll be reintroducing legislation to help DOE do just that. According to the EPA, the building sector accounts for 31% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Public buildings such as schools and hospitals tend to be the most energy intensive because they are larger, older, and usually have higher electricity demand. And so can you talk a little bit about what you have been able to do through the Office of State and Community Energy Programs at DOE for schools and hospitals and municipal buildings?
This is really important too. The schools piece, as an example, there's a funding opportunity announcement to be able to allow schools to retrofit for weatherization. It was way oversubscribed. The need is enormous. And so to the extent that we can work together, Congress can work on upping that so that schools can take advantage of this, because their heating bills or cooling bills, depending, eat up a huge amount of budget that they could be using for educational resources.
I run out of time, but the last point I will make is about lowering cost. That's the other big point of this, is to lower costs for families. So thank you so much for your testimony, and thank you, Mr.
Ladies,
Chairman.
time's expired. I go to Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Granholm, thank you for being here. I echo his comments, John Curtis, about coming to the meeting. I was part of that. I sat right beside you, and you did a good job. Thanks. And actually, I'm part of the Science Committee. I know the Science Committee's been trying to get you there because the Department of Energy's critical R&D programs are about a third of the DOE's annual budget. Do you have plans to meet at the Science Committee?
I know that my undersecretaries, didn't they testify there yesterday? The two undersecretaries, I know, did.
I wanted to get that out of the way because that's important too. Do you have any plans to impose a cap on the total volume of U.S. LNG exports?
I do not. I don't have any plans on doing that. We do have a request for information on the street about how we should consider all of this, including how the exports impact natural gas.
Well, we have 2.5 LNG plants in my district. I'm in the Gulf Coast of Texas, and we export a lot of it. And we get one on the we got one that's pretty well underway, and then one on the drawing board, so 4 total, I guess. I think we can send more gas to Europe to help them wean off of Russian gas. So obviously you support LNG exports to Europe.
As you've seen, we have granted export licenses to a whole slew. In fact, we've got, for those LNG terminals that are under construction. That will be 20 BCF of LNG to go, which is a huge amount. There's another 20 that have been licensed that aren't even under construction. So there is a universe of LNG that is available for Europe. The question is whether they get a final investment decision.
Okay, well, yeah, that's absolutely right. Do you agree with the existing DOE studies that showed the net economic benefits of expanded LNG exports? Have you seen those studies?
Who wrote the study?
The DOE?
Wait, which, do you know which?
It's the, I don't.
Is it FEC, the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management?
It may be, you might.
I have to go back and take a look at.
We'll look at that later then. Any plans to revisit those existing studies? I guess you are, you're talking about it now, you
Well,
go back and look at them.
looking at, I mean, we want to look at the impacts, because we are really blessed, as you know, with a huge amount of natural gas. And the question is, how do exports impact greenhouse gas emissions? How does methane, how do we deal with all of that? And what does it do in terms of domestic pricing for natural gas? So
We want to be careful with that. In our rush to go green, we want to make sure that we don't do a number on our energy industry. So we want to be careful with that. Do you believe that the cooking products rule is far-reaching and deserves a complete transparent rulemaking process from the DOE, which would include sufficient time for comments? Because there's a lot of people in Texas that are going to be unhappy if the regulations for gas. I was an air conditioning contractor for 35 years. I know what super high efficiency ratings did to the cost of equipment. It was hardest on the lowest income people because they never planned to replace their air conditioning. And when the equipment became more expensive, it was hard on them. But anyway, do you believe the cooking products rule is far reaching? And will there be a good comment period on it?
there is a comment period on it, and we are always, in fact, we just extended the comment period for another one because we want to make sure that we get all of the feedback necessary before issuing any final rule.
Okay, good to hear that. Are you aware that households that use natural gas, which we have a lot of LNG in Texas, for heating, cooking, and clothes drying save an average of $1,068 per year over electric appliances? $1,068 a year in savings, natural gas, cooking, heating, clothes drying over electricity.
And
That's not a small amount.
and the electric and the gas furnaces, the gas stoves, we want them to be efficient too. And that's what the rule was about. It's about creating, but it was for higher end gas stoves.
Well, it's a little harder to get efficiency up on them as it is furnaces, which wound up with a 90% AFUE rating. So I was very familiar with the SEER ratings and I sold my company 5 years ago. It's hard on people. The more expensive the appliances and stuff are, the more it hurts those who can at least afford it. Well, I've got about 49 seconds, so are you aware that switching from gas to electricity costs thousands of dollars in a home? When we went into a house, if they had an electric furnace and they want to go gas, then you're talking about a gas company, you're talking about a plumber, you're talking about a gas meter, you're talking about a lot more labor. You know that that's pretty expensive, right?
Well, I would say that with the incentives that are about heat pumps, for example, to reduce the cost, what we have seen in the modeling is that, in fact, it reduces on average cost.
Well, I will tell you that heat pumps are a lot more expensive than regular conventional air
That's what I'm saying, is the
conditioners.
incentives for the heat pumps really bring down the cost. The rebates that will be there can reduce by half in many cases, especially for poor or lower income. It can replace almost the full thing.
But if you're going all electric and you've got to go to natural gas, it's expensive. I'm out of time, and I got a plane to catch. Thank you for being here. I yield back.
Mr. Armstrong is recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think before I start, I'll just point out that everything is cheaper if it has a rebate, an incentive, a tax break, or a subsidy, not just green energy. And I will continue to say that when we talk about cost competitiveness. But the EPA had a rule 2 weeks ago, a proposed rule that's going to have 2/3 of all car sales be electric by 2032. You spoke earlier about 160 battery companies coming to the United States, which I actually think is great and dealing with all of this. But the top 5 critical minerals in a car battery are lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and manganese. Lithium, Australia produces 52%, Chile produces 25%, China produces 13%. But China actually has a stranglehold on the lithium supply chain, and they have invested $6 billion worth of assets in lithium in Chile, Canada, and Australia, and currently holds north of 60% of the refining capacity. There's one mine in the United States, and it cannot cover 20% of the current EV consumption. And I agree with the aspirational growth. Permitting reform, if we had DOT or EPA in here, I would be asking about transmission infrastructure and how we're actually going to charge these cars when they're on the road. I don't. I have you in here, Madam Secretary. And so under the current construction and regulatory construct, how much lithium are we going to mine in the United States in 2032?
I don't know by 2032, but I do know that there is a huge amount of lithium resources in the United States
There's a ton of lithium
Right.
resources in the United States. I don't think we'll have a lithium mine permitted by 2032.
Well, that's the whole thing. Let's work together on that. Let's work together on reforming the Mining Act.
But that's the whole policy point behind this, is it's like we're blowing up the bridge and then we're going to figure out a way to cross the river.
But I would
We should have
imagine,
the permitting reform before we have the EPA mandate to make 2/3 of all new car sales electric by 2032.
well, I disagree. I think we can do it if we can come together, Democrats and Republicans, to reform the Mining Act, for example, and speed up permitting.
Top 3 places in the United States to mine cobalt are Congo, Russia, Australia. How much cobalt are we going to mine in the United States by 2032?
Well, we may not. It may be that we have a friend, like in Australia or like in Canada.
When you're looking at the rare earth mineral list, we better not anger the Aussies or we're going to be in a real difficult problem. Nickel, Indonesia, Philippines, Russia, New Caledonia, Australia, Canada, China. How much nickel are we going to
And
mine
a
in the
number of
United
those
States?
are very friendly countries that want to have those arrangements. That's why Canada is very interested, Australia is very interested, Japan is very
How much
interested.
nickel are we going to mine in the United States by 2000?
I hope we mine a good amount by then.
Manganese, South Africa, Australia, China, Gabon, Brazil. How much manganese are we going to mine in the United
I
States
hope
by
we do what we need and we onshore the rest.
Graphite, China, Madagascar, Mozambique, Brazil, South Korea, Russia, Canada. How much graphite are we going to mine in the United States? by
Same answer.
Hope is not a policy. I want to just talk a little bit about the Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve, which was established in 2014 to address supply issues following Hurricane Sandy. The budget requests an 8% increase to support a 1 million barrel reserve. Do you know approximately how many days of Northeast gasoline consumption the reserve would support?
It's not very much.
It's like 1 day, I think, isn't it?
It's a small amount.
The gasoline reserves are commingled in tanks with commercial supplies costing about $13 per barrel a year to maintain. If a storm disrupts the supply at commercial Raritan Bay facility, the DOE reserves would almost certainly face disruption because the gasoline is commingled. Doesn't this place the reserve at the same level of risk as the commercial supply they are meant to supplement?
Well, I would say this, that it is important for that area to feel like they have a bit of an insurance policy, given that it is an area that often is difficult to get supply to. So it's important for them, and that's one of the reasons why it exists.
Yeah, but citing previous operational concerns, the Department of Energy officials told GAO in 2022 that the current administration was considering its position on whether to continue or recommend closing the gasoline product reserve. Has the administration determined its position on the gasoline reserve?
I think they're going to keep it open.
Between the limited scale, commingled supplies, and excessive cost per barrel, the Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve merits significant review. I mean, we have to figure it out.
Yeah.
The very disruptions we're trying to protect are going to have the same problems for our actual reserve. And then I would just comment, instead of permitting the necessary infrastructure to diversely move products to the Northeast, we have a commingled supply that will end up being under the same consequences as of a natural disaster of what we're trying to get to. So I just would hope the department would focus on existing operational maintenance challenges associated with the core SBR for dump money into ineffective product reserves. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'll now go to Mr. Fluker from Texas, 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary. Thank you for being here. Would you consider yourself the principal advisor to the president for energy matters?
I'm the Secretary of Energy. I'm one of the main advisors, but he's got a few.
But you're the principal advisor.
Well, I don't know that I would say that. I think he's got some
The
very
Secretary of
good
Energy.
advisors in the White
I
House.
believe in this position. I represent the Permian Basin. We've had this conversation before. We produce about 43% of the country's crude oil. It's the most secure supply of oil and gas in the entire world. And in fact, I would also go a step further, that it's probably the only thing that has kept this economy going despite the policies that we've seen. Very concerned about those policies, and I just have a couple of questions for you. Based on, being the Secretary of Energy, When the president went to Saudi Arabia and asked OPEC Plus to increase production, was that your recommendation to him to do that?
I think the president wanted to see greater production in the United States also.
We have that ability.
And
That's why
he's
HR1
been asking
is so
for it.
important. And Madam Secretary, you are the Secretary of Energy. We are blessed as a country to have the most enormous amount of reserves, not just of oil and gas, but of so many other critical minerals and things that have been discussed today. Did you recommend that he go to Saudi Arabia and ask for them to produce more oil?
I was not in that conversation.
So he did not ask the Secretary of Energy for
I was
your
not in that
recommendation?
conversation. But I will say this, he has been very strong about asking for greater supply here in the United States.
And we have that capacity to do that. I'm extremely troubled with the fact that for a political emergency, the president released over half of our SPR. At what point in time will you make a recommendation to the president or act upon current law to refill?
We will be refilling, as
What's
you're probably.
do you have a timeline?
As soon as we're finished with the current congressionally mandated sale, which we are required to do before the end of the fiscal year, as soon as that's done, because as you're probably aware, you can't take in and release at the same time, we will begin the process.
I'd like for you to
of
follow up
refilling.
for the record on that one, to let us know what that timeline looks like. I'm going to move to the next question.
Starting this summer.
You said we cannot flip a switch today, but the administration has actually tried to flip that switch. Just a couple of questions for you when it comes to what's the total amount of electricity that our country needs on an annual basis?
Well, right now, we have about 1,400 gigawatts on our grid.
On an annual basis, what does that equate to?
Well, 1,400 gigawatts on the grid, so how much electricity we have a bunch of different sources of electricity that are provided. We use about three.
It's about 4 trillion kilowatt hours per year. And I would expect you to know that because when we have a 2032 mandate to get to electric vehicles like my colleague just mentioned, my next question is, what will the increase in that total amount of annual
We have to
demand
double the size of the electric grid by 2035.
Double. So what portion of our grid is serviced by hydrocarbons right now?
About 40% is natural gas, about 17% is coal, and the rest is clean.
Okay, so it's about 20%, 22% coal, 19% nuclear.
17%. It's as of right now.
This is from y'all's website.
Well,
38% natural gas and 20% renewable. So what in 2032, if we have to double, and thank you for that answer. That's actually more than I was expecting you to say. If we have to double the amount of electricity, where is that going to come from?
That's going to come from growing our energy pie.
In what pieces of pie will grow?
We want to increase clean.
Clean. So what does that mean? What is clean?
So that means let's increase nuclear. Let's increase hydroelectric power. Let's increase geothermal.
What about places that don't have hydro?
Well, that's why you have a transmission grid, to be able to bring electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed.
When was the last time you visited the Permian Basin?
I have not been to the Permian Basin.
It's the most prolific production area for energy in this country.
Will you invite me?
I have invited you.
I didn't know that.
I invited you last year when I saw you in a meeting.
Great.
And I'll invite you again. This area helped us win World War II. This area has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. This administration is choosing to not use the best of the above strategy. I'm not an all of the above kind of person. I'm a best of the above. And that's different for different places. Hydrocarbons in some places, clean natural gas, maybe if you have hydroelectric. We have more wind energy in my congressional district than the entire state of California. Come see it. It doesn't always work. The wind in West Texas in July when it's 110 degrees in the middle of summer doesn't blow.
But your sun shines.
But it does. And give me a battery that works for more than 4 hours that services the largest electric grid in the country.
Yeah.
We don't want to be like Europe. We don't want to be like California. That's why we're trying to use a best of the above approach. My time has expired, but I would like to see, Mr. Chairman, the timeline for when the SPR is going to be refilled. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go to Mr. Carter from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you letting me wave on to this committee. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. I believe I'm your last questioner. So
I don't think so.
one more? Oh, you got one more. Okay. Well, nevertheless, I'm your next to last. And I want to ask you, as I'm sure you're aware, on another subcommittee that I serve on, we had EPA Administrator Regan before us just a couple of days ago, just the other day. And it's my understanding that the Department of Energy and the EPA have signed a joint memorandum of understanding on electric reliability. And that your announcement of this MOU highlights the challenges of transitioning to clean energy. But you know, I find it interesting since that MOU was announced in March, it seems like the EPA has announced as many new rules or changes that it can that would threaten grid reliability. I mean, just today, EPA announced a new power plan rule that's going to put significant new requirements on our baseload generation. I'm really concerned about this. This is after a holiday season that saw 9 states experience blackouts and brownouts. I mean, even in the state of Georgia, fortunately, we didn't have any blackouts or brownouts, but the EMCs tell me that we were at peak capacity, that we could not have done any more than what we did. And we're a growing state. My district is a growing state. Just had the largest economic development project ever announced in the district, in the state of Georgia. And so we're growing, and we're going to need reliability. We're going to need that in our state, and the rest of the country is going to need it as well. Last week, FERC Commissioner Mark Christie said that the problem is not the addition of intermittent resources, but the rapid subtraction of dispatchable resources like coal and gas. He also said, and I quote, "The U.S. is heading for a reliability crisis because dispatchable generating resources are retiring far too quickly and in quantities that threaten our ability to keep the lights on," unquote. Do you agree that the U.S. is heading for a reliability crisis?
No, I think we have to do it right. And I think that's why.
Do you think we're doing it right?
Well, I think what the EPA rule did was to say we want to reduce emissions, and it didn't say how. We have been working on all of this technology to decarbonize, and whether it's coal or natural gas, we want clean baseload power. I heard a number of members of this side of the aisle say this is about emissions. So let's work on that. Let's decarbonize and allow for baseload power to exist.
Well, I'm encouraged to hear you say that because I believe that. I don't believe it's about fewer choices. I believe it's about less carbon.
And more
not
technology.
less choices. So I'm encouraged to hear you say that, but then I see the rules that are being implemented here by the EPA that concern me because it is putting our grid reliability at risk here. You know, I had the opportunity to go to Europe last year as a member of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and we saw and witnessed in Europe what has happened there, and they have allowed their policies to get ahead of their innovation, resulting in a mess, to be quite honest with you. They closed down their nuclear plants and ended up going back to coal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are important lessons to be learned there, and I certainly hope we're paying attention and learning those lessons.
Yeah, we certainly are, and I agree with you. We have to be thoughtful about this transition.
But, you know, again, the Biden administration has said that by 2030, they want 80% renewable energy. And right now, you said it's how much of our portfolio?
We want to get to 100% by 2035 with an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. And what are we at right now?
In terms of, we are at, in terms of clean, we have 20% that is nuclear, we have 20% that is renewable.
Are you still confident that that's an achievable goal?
I am, because of the policies that were just adopted. I know you didn't vote for them, but they're
No, and I'm not going to vote for them because I believe that we are going to make the same mistake that they made in Europe and allow our policies to get ahead of our innovation, and we can't do that. We can't afford to do that. Look, I would submit to you, Madam Secretary, that what has happened in our economy is a direct result of the policies of this administration. It's self-inflicted. Day one, this administration declared war on fossil fuels, resulting in higher gas prices, resulting in higher inflation, resulting in higher interest rates, and now we've got the problems that we've got here. Whereas my colleague just pointed out, we've got an abundance of oil here. We've got an abundance. And again, here we are in a nation that has decreased our carbon emissions more in the last decade than the next 12 countries combined while growing our economy.
And we are still a record producer of oil and of natural gas. So declaring war has not happened. In fact, we are at record production.
We are at record production, but we can do even better is the point. And we don't need to decrease choices, we need to decrease carbon. That's what we should be doing.
Let's work on it.
Madam Secretary, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I am willing to work on it with you, and I look forward to that.
Great.
Gentleman's time's expired, and I'll go to the last Congresswoman of the day, Ms. Barragan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I have been here for a short time, but very impressed at your ability to respond to very specific questions. Madam Secretary, do you know what environmental justice means?
I do.
That would mean that you know more than the last administration's energy secretary that sat before this committee and couldn't describe it or explain it. So when I hear these very direct questions about specific numbers and places, I'm very impressed. Secretary Granholm, the infrastructure law President Biden and Democrats in Congress passed included $84 million for demonstration projects that use enhanced geothermal technology. There's a lot of geothermal potential in California and other parts of the country. How is the Department of Energy using these funds to meet its enhanced geothermal shot goal, to cut geothermal energy costs, and what more can Congress do to support your work?
I'm so glad you asked this question because I am such a huge fan of geothermal, the heat beneath our feet, which is 24/7 dispatchable, baseload, clean power. We need to do more. So we do have this Earth Shot. The Earth Shot is to reduce the cost of geothermal so that we can see more of it happen. We also have the ability through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law to help invest in facilities that are able to get to that geothermal. Honestly, the oil and gas companies should be embracing this, given their expertise in hydraulic fracturing. They know where the hot spots are, and they know how to get to them, and they know the subsurface, and they have employees who have a skill set that is ready to go. So we are very enthusiastic about continuing the technology advances, particularly on the drill bits, as well as on the extraction processes, whether it's enhanced or advanced geothermal, closed loop or open loop. We're very interested in all of it.
Oh, great. And I understand that today the Department of Energy is holding an Enhanced Geothermal Shot Summit. And so I want to thank you for your commitment to this clean energy resource. And follow-up to that, if the Department of Energy can meet the cost reduction goals of enhanced geothermal, I believe that's going to unlock 24/7 power in many parts of the United States. How significant would this be for our climate and clean energy goals?
Yeah, to all of the questions that we were just talking about clean, dispatchable baseload power, it would unlock so much. There is the potential for geothermal no matter how far down you go. It all depends on how far down you go. It is everywhere. And so if we could really unearth that, if we could really crack the code on it, it could be the holy grail.
Great. And this is a bipartisan issue. It's something I've been working on, one of my colleagues across the aisle on, who represents Utah, Mr. Curtis. I want to chat with you about marine energy. Secretary Granholm, the infrastructure law also provided $70 million to further develop marine energy. There's a lot of wave energy potential off the coast of California, and a pilot project soon underway at Altasea in my district, which is at the Port of Los Angeles. Can you tell me how the Department of Energy is using these funds to advance marine energy, and what more can Congress do to support the marine energy research and development? And just to give you an idea, I recently had a company from Israel come and share what they were doing there to bring down to the Los Angeles port that can basically produce energy from waves.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty remarkable. And so just thought I'd ask about that.
Yeah, it is hugely, the ability for machines at the floor of the seabed to be able to harness that energy is a huge opportunity. We are trying to reduce the costs of those machines so that it becomes affordable. But here's what we've done. The Water Power Technology Office, they've actually issued now 3 funding opportunities to support the impact of the expansion of low-impact hydropower and pumped storage hydropower, whether there's dams, but there's also, you can have pumped storage on a smaller sort of distributed manner. All of those are technology advances that we are focused on. We also have put $40 million in the budget for the Natural Marine Energy Centers, and the Marine Energy R&D is that $70 million funding opportunity that we announced this week.
Great, well, thank you, and I appreciate that you mentioned that in the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats have included billions in home electrification incentives with priority for low and moderate income households so they can make that switch. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. She yields back. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing document list. Without objection, that will be the order. I'll remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witness to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on May 25th. And Madam Secretary, thanks for being here. Thanks for bearing with us during votes, and we'll stand adjourned.